Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome you to a special time in this broadcast. This is a special time known as Agent Smith time. If you've never been in the stream during this time, what's going to happen is I'm going to be in Discord with a real life friend of mine. This is not a podcast, this is a real person. And he's very knowledgeable about a stuff that I know basically nothing about. World history, economics, current events. I don't read the news. He loves reading the news. And he's really sharp. So he's going to try and weigh in, talk about the facts of what's going on, and also engage with you. This is an interactive time. So if you have questions for him, you want to set some topics for the discourse over these next couple hours, type it in the chat, tag WhiskeryAnt, and if it's an appropriate question, it'll be passed along to Agent Smith himself, and we can tackle this stuff. I will continue to play StarCraft during this time, so if you don't like hearing words being said, you can just mute me and just watch the gameplay. But it's a pretty good time. This is going to be episode number 43. If you can't be here for the whole thing, it'll be on YouTube. Let's get into the action. Ladies and gentlemen, what's up, Agent Smith?
Oh, hello.
What's up, dude?
Oh, not much. How are you?
I'm mostly recovered. I did a 24-hour stream yesterday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I feel better than terrible, which is good.
Kind of a low bar, but okay.
Yeah, I was actually playing pretty well. Normally, I have kind of a debuff for about 2 to 3 days after a 24-hour just because my body is messed up. But I slept for 8 hours, and then I woke up for an hour, and then I went back to sleep for another 5 hours. And then I went for a run. And I think the run is equally important to the sleep. It feels like whenever I wake up after sleeping after a 24-hour, like I'm emerging from a cocoon or something. Like my body is... It's a different type of sleep that's more of a hibernation. So my body is really groggy and clunky, so getting the cardiovascular system up and running and engaging the muscles and getting some fresh air goes a super long way. So I actually went up in MMR on my main account today.
Oh, impressive.
Yeah. How
Well,
have you been?
I'm fine. Just been doing my ritual holiday game binging, like I always do.
That's good. Video games are fun. I had someone come in during the 24-hour stream saying that I was wasting my life and my brain on video games and that I was addicted and I had a problem and stuff. It was pretty amusing given that this is my profession.
Yeah, you get all kinds on the internet.
Yep.
Big public forum.
Yep, it was mostly supportive. It was a good run. I think the 16-hour to 21-hour was the most difficult of this one. Because you're well over your normal streaming amount, and it's getting pretty long, and you're also pretty far from the finish line. I had a few viewers come in and be like, oh, 16 hours in, you still got a long way to go. It's like, thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I guess that's part of the attraction of streaming. They can kind of interact with you like that.
Yep. Yep, this will be our Agent Smith before Christmas. We'll be heading out of town in 2 days.
Yeah, this is the Christmas special.
Yeah. We did a Christmas special for the Pylon Show, which is the talk show that I frequent pretty often, yeah. And it was different in that it was much longer. We did a 4-hour episode and we were all drinking. So it was quite the time.
I bet that was a lot of fun.
Yep.
Cool. I don't think we'll be quite that entertaining today.
Psh. This is good stuff. What's been happening in the world? I must confess, with my binging of streaming, I haven't really been keeping too close a tabs on the ways of the world.
Nothing important blew up, if that's what you mean. All of the major capitals are intact, so nothing too dramatic.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Gosh, if I had to pick, I've got stuff in my notes, but I don't want to drag on too long before we get to questions. I did have a correction I wanted to get to eventually. Well, there was a nominal trade understanding, I guess, between China and the United States. You know, Trump and President Trump and Xi Jinping kind of reached an understanding that their little trade war will basically be frozen for about 90 days while they try to negotiate some final deal, or at least move in that direction. But let's see, there was also, China also agreed to do more to regulate fentanyl production. That was kind of low-hanging fruit. And because for those who don't know, fentanyl is like, and maybe you know more about this than me, it's like a type of marijuana, is that what it was? Some kind of addictive or drug?
It's a prescription drug, I believe it is rather dangerous, if I remember correctly. Here, let me Google it real fast. Yeah, because that rings a bell. I think I've heard of that before. Hang on. It is a high risk for addiction and dependency. It treats severe pain. It's a narcotic. Yeah. So we've touched on this before. I think it was probably 20 or 30 episodes ago, so this was a while back. But we've talked about the treatment of pain in the pharmaceutical industry and how if you prescribe a pain medication, these pain medications work. They're quite powerful, but once the body gets it in its system, you acclimate to that, and it becomes less and less effective over time. And the brain science of this is the mechanism of downregulation. So if a drug enters the body, you have receptors for that drug, and that activates a response from the body. And if the body notices, oh, there's plenty of this drug, we have more receptors than we need to detect this, then we're going to, it's like effectively firing some of your receptors, saying, you know what, we don't need you working for our company anymore. We already have enough lookouts to tell us if the fentanyl is coming through, or fentanyl. So we're gonna have less of you. So basically what you have to do with the drug is add more and more of the drug over time, which creates a cycle where it's kind of deciding, when does it end? When do you say, you know what, we're not going to up your prescription anymore, you're going to stay at this one, which means you are going to be in some pain. So it's about pain management rather than eliminating pain from your life entirely. It's really tough to figure out, and it is physiologically addictive too. So there's a difference between psychological addiction, which would be stuff like World of Warcraft, and physiological addiction, which is like being hungry. You're hungry for that drug in a physical capacity where your body is just craving it, and if it doesn't get it, then oftentimes you'll just really aggressively seek it out. Which maybe some people are thinking right now, well, I do that with World of Warcraft. Well, yeah.
That's a good summary. Well, a lot of that fentanyl consumed in the United States actually originates in China. And so there's been some pressure in the Chinese government to try to crack down on fentanyl production in China and to cooperate more with the United States in going after that trade. So that was part of this nominal agreement made between Trump and Xi Jinping. But like I said, that's kind of low-hanging fruit. Like, that wasn't really a stretch. That wasn't a big ask.
Well,
but, they also,
another thing, if I can guess at some
go
context here, is the pain addiction kind of situation is one that would pretty heavily affect a lot of Trump's base. Because this is something that happens a lot in rural towns. They'll have an epidemic of this addiction where basically a bunch of people get prescribed this. It's pretty easy to get prescriptions for pain medication. And then you know someone's mom or somebody who has it and they don't use all of it. And then you become a dealer and it kind of becomes like the town is gripped by addiction to this sort of thing. So people in a lot of these rural states are, I think, percentage more likely to be favoring Trump So for him to press this issue, it fits his kind of dynamic of China's the enemy, and also my demographic is affected directly by this substance that's coming from them. So for me to take a stand, it looks good to them.
Yeah, that's pretty much a nutshell. That's pretty much the issue in a nutshell. You know, the Trump administration does have good motivation to push that, and you know, again, the Chinese government doesn't really have to give up anything to do that. Like, the Chinese government doesn't really want fentanyl production in China either. China has pretty strict drug laws, so that's pretty much well within their wheelhouse. They also agreed to lower tariffs on cars, specifically U.S. cars, to 15%. They'd previously raised them to 40% once the trade war kind of got going. So that was kind of a nice symbolic gesture, basically, to try to kind of make nice and give the U.S. something, try to encourage more progress in the trade talks. It's not really a big concession, though, because China's been talking about lowering car tariffs for a while. That's kind of part of their development strategy. They want to slowly introduce more foreign competition to try to get their car producers to be more efficient and economical. That's a common strategy with a lot of export export development strategies that have been used in places like Japan and South Korea. I don't think China's doing exactly the same thing, but it seems like they're trying to do something similar with the car industry specifically. So that wasn't necessarily a big concession, but it was a nice symbolic gesture, and it kind of, the fact that they would do that suggests that the talks are kind of moving in a positive direction anyway. And then the other thing they did was allowed purchase or purchase directly 1 million tons plus of soybeans. They had canceled a big contract when the trade war kind of started, so that's also another nice little symbolic gesture. Normally they buy like 30 million tons in a year, so 1 million isn't really a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. But again, it's baby steps. It's more about signals at this point that it is big, significant trade concessions or negotiations. They're just slowly moving into negotiations, basically. So again, none of this is really concrete. This is all just early going. We'll see where it kind of goes. Early signals are at least encouraging. They suggest that kind of everybody's making the right moves in the rain dance of trade negotiations for a substantive deal to eventually be reached, but there's no telling whether or not they'll actually negotiate anything by the time that 90-day window closes. Anybody's guess, so we'll see. But it's something to watch. But I wouldn't call it substantive thus far, so just kind of watch out for that, because I'm sure one group or another will try to characterize it as a complete failure or a complete success or what have you, and really it's more just minor early negotiating type stuff. So there was that. There's been a lot of drama in Sri Lanka lately, but I don't know if anybody really is that interested in it. And Sri Lanka is kind of marginal, so if somebody wants to get into that, they can kind of ask in chat, but otherwise I'll kind of let that go. The Thai government actually announced that they're going to allow elections in 2019. They've been delaying since, what, 2016 or when it 2014? Actually, I think it's been, 4 years now. So, for those who don't know, the military in Thailand seized power in 2014, basically overthrew the democratic government. That was part of a whole other series of events that involved protests and instability in Thailand. We can talk about that too sometime if somebody wants. But basically, the military had said after the coup that they would allow elections in a year, I think, was the original announcement. And then after that kind of 1-year deadline started to approach, they delayed it 6 months. And they've basically been delaying it by 6 months, 6-month increments ever since, roughly. And so they've said that they're actually kind of going to move forward this time. They're actually going to honor that. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Whether or not they actually have the elections, and then if they do, how the different parties perform. The military also, during that 4-year interim, wrote a new constitution, and it's kind of like Burma's constitution, in that it gives the military like disproportionate power in the political system. I think they've got some specific number of seats in the legislature that are going to be specifically reserved for appointees of the military, so they're going to have a direct role in managing government affairs legislatively. So we'll see kind of how democratic Thailand actually becomes if they have the elections. It's kind of iffy given that constitution, and whether or not the people of Thailand are willing to accept it. Thailand's history over the past 100 years is kind of littered with attempts at democratization and then regression into military dictatorship, and then kind of a constant battle between forces of liberalism and authoritarianism. So this is kind of a continuation of that trend. It's an interesting story to watch as it plays out. It's probably a little more exciting than the people of Thailand might like, but such is political history of Thailand. So I guess off the top of my head, those would be kind of the big ones. Oh, I guess if we're going to do this, Japan opened up their borders to a degree. Did you hear about that?
No.
Yeah, so Japan's kind of had this issue for a while with a labor shortage, basically. And so there's been kind of a lot of hemming and hawing in Japan, policy-wise, about whether or not they should allow more immigrants. And they've actually been kind of doing that over the past 10 years, but it's not really been nearly enough. It's kind of been more experimental to see how they would do it and what it would look like. And I think they call it a technical training program, which is kind of a euphemism for immigration program, basically, letting in workers and whatnot. But the government now is talking about really opening it up much more. It's still not going to be fully open. You know, they're not going to be the U.S. or anything like that, but it's going to be a lot more open than it has been. And to kind of run through that real quick, there's going to be 2 new visa categories. And in the first category, you'll be allowed to stay for 5 years. And in order to qualify for that, you have to reach a certain level of skills and have a certain proficiency in Japanese. So for the second category, then, you can apply for residency after that 5. You get to stay for 5 years, and then after that, you can apply for residency. But that's only going to be allowed for people of very high skills. But that's definitely a big change from before. I don't think they've really allowed that to the same degree. So those are the 2 new visa categories that they're going to create. This is going to take place next year. I think this is when they're going to implement the policy. And they're expecting something like up to 300,000 immigrants could eventually come. Not right away, but, you know, over the long run, it'll eventually add up to 300,000. And it'll be mostly, they'll be focusing mostly on things like nurses, construction workers, maybe agricultural workers, what have you. Specific industries, basically, that have critical shortages of labor of one sort or another. Those will be the ones that can kind of get these visas, or apply for these visas, rather. So it's not like it's going to be anybody working in any industry can apply for these. It's specific industries, probably politically connected ones for that matter. That's a whole other conversation. Political opposition in Japan has kind of hit on 4 points, principally, from what I read. For one, there's concern that the measure will depress wages. That's sort of the usual argument against immigration. There's concern that there will actually be abuse of migrants. That's kind of already happened with the technical training program that I mentioned. Basically, workers will come over, and then employers kind of don't have a lot of accountability. So they'll use their power over those migrants. And the fact that they can kind of just fire them and basically force them to leave Japan, because you have to have that job to be there and hold the visa. So they can use that leverage to make them work excessive hours and reduce pay, or maybe even withhold pay entirely. So there's been some stories like that, and there's some concern that opening up immigration will just exacerbate that kind of problem. There's also there's some people are uncomfortable with the easier path to residency. That's just traditional Japanese aversion to having lots of immigrants. And then let's see. And then the 4th point that the opposition has brought up is that there's concern that the migrants will end up in the cities. And the reason that's a concern is that most of the shortages are more in the rural areas. And cities are already pretty crowded in Japan, so that's kind of understandable. You know, Japan is notorious for having very expensive property and rent and whatnot. So there's some concern that migrants will kind of come and apply for jobs in rural areas, but will then end up in urban areas anyway.
Well, we've talked about the aging population of Japan before. It seems like they are going to need something to fill the gap, because the young generation isn't reproducing very fast, and the country's getting very old for your average age. So yeah, who's gonna do the labor in the future?
Yeah, that's kind of the million-dollar question. And Japanese business in general has been kind of wanting to resolve that by taking in more immigrants of one sort or to some degree.
I thought you were gonna say robots.
Well, yeah, actually, that is kind of been the direction that a lot of policymakers in Japan have tried to push. They've kind of tried to encourage the development of that industry, the robotics industry in Japan, in order to try to alleviate some of the shortage. But I don't think they're going to be able to develop it fast enough in order to meet enough of the demand. And it is kind of ballooning, although that's kind of a mixed bag. The thing about a shrinking population, the thing about having an aging population is that the population is also shrinking. So one of the things that happens is that, well, let me give you an anecdote that kind of illustrates the point. This is kind of the crux of what I'm getting to. There was a lot of people who started investing money in retirement homes in Japan because they saw the trend in the population getting older. But what actually happened is a lot of them over the past 5-10 years roughly actually started having to shut down because there weren't enough elderly people. And that has to do with the population falling. It's true that the population is getting older, but it's also true that the overall absolute number of older people is actually shrinking with time. So that was actually kind of a mistake to overinvest in the care home industry. So it's not necessarily the case that that's going to be a problem in the long run. In that vein, I'm not sure how I got onto that, but sorry.
I said that the population was aging and shrinking, so this immigration thing may have been connected to their awareness of that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's how it, right. So they're not necessarily going to need that many immigrants in the future because the demand for immigrants in certain industries like care home nurses and whatnot, that's actually going to fall as the population shrinks. I think that's the point I was trying to make. Thank you, Neuro. Sometimes I need help.
Where was I again?
Yeah. But in other industries, they'll definitely need more, construction and stuff like that. Because that's, there's still going to be the same demand, but a falling ability to supply it with Japanese workers. So that'll be immigrants probably filling that gap. Or not. There may be too much opposition. There may eventually be some kind of blowback politically once they start implementing the new policy, and then we'll see what happens. But yeah, it's a big policy change for Japan to kind of move in this direction. It had been kind of stuck in gear for a long time. There was policy stagnation on the immigration issue in Japan. So now that's kind of gotten unstuck, and it's a big experiment, basically, because Japan has traditionally been kind of opposed to having too many foreigners come in. So it's a very interesting experiment to watch, because we'll get to see kind of how they react to that. So that's something to keep an eye on, basically, in the next year. Okay. So that's enough for the updating, I think. We can get into some of our questions. We had a whole bunch last week. Did you just want to kind of skip those and focus on the new ones first?
We can hit those if we have questions near the end. Or if we have time at the end and we've gone through all the questions.
Okay, I think that's how we generally do it, but I wanted to ask. Let's see, where was the first one? Okay, last week you discussed the banks creating their own quote-unquote digital currencies to regain some amount of control over the money supply. Can you describe how mechanically they'd go about doing that? How would it be different from today's system? I don't know how different it would be from today's system. I think it would be kind of more of a technical change. Because right now the banks just kind of willy-nilly move money around digitally, and central banks don't have a lot of oversight over it. So I think it would be more of a cosmetic change meant to empower the regulatory apparatus, to give them a little more control, a little more oversight that they kind of don't have now with the digital system. Let me preface this answer by saying that I'm not an expert in finance by any stretch. So, this is based off of limited reading on my part, so I'm not the best person to ask. And actually, on that note, that would be a good time for the disclaimer, the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything we talk about here. If you're new to the segment, I don't try to proselytize. I can get stuff wrong. So if I say anything biased or wrong or what have you, please, chat is definitely encouraged to point it out. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it after. So, just throwing that out there. I feel like I'm forgetting something as part of the usual disclaimer, but I'm blanking out. Well, yeah, it's meant to be a conversation. I think that's it. You know, chat is encouraged to kind of participate and contribute and whatnot. You know, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, basically. I have a stronger background in some things than other things. I'm a more economics, foreign policy, political economy. Some of the other stuff we talk about is just stuff I've read in the news or something I read a report about or saw a documentary about, and then other stuff, you know, just read Wikipedia or whatever, or just heard something, you know. So there's a full range of knowledge there. Definitely not everything I'm an expert in, so don't take what I'm saying as gospel truth.
Is this guy just reading straight from Wikipedia?
Yeah, we got that last week. I can't read that fast. Sorry. Let's see. So that said, I have a limited background in finance, but from what I've read and from what I heard, it's kind of meant to be more of a regulatory change. So how they would actually go about it, they would probably just change the laws, the relevant laws on the books, so that they could have more control, so that, you know, banks would be required to report more of the digital goings-on, so to speak, of their banking operations. That probably sounds very ignorant to anybody who has a background in finance, so I apologize. Again, this is my limited understanding of it. But I don't know the details of how they would do it. This is just my impression, that it would be mostly regulatory and legal changes, more so than any substantive practical changes or fundamental changes to how the banking system works. So let's see. Oh, I forgot. Yeah, I wanted to make a correction, a pseudo correction. Because last week we were talking about the Ukraine, which always gets me into trouble. It always seems like either the Russians or the Ukrainians get aggravated whenever we talk about the Ukraine. It seems like one group or another, and I think there was a Russian guy, maybe.
No, it was me. I think who brought up it's not the Ukraine, it's Ukraine. Because
no, this is something else.
Oh.
But that is one of the things that we were getting yelled at for. Now, somebody asked, we were talking about the Sea of Azov as an incident, because there were some Ukrainian cutters or Coast Guard vessels who were seized by the Russians, and people were asking about it. And somebody asked why I hadn't mentioned that the Ukrainian government was threatening to blow up the Sea of Azov bridge, and insinuating that that was kind of relevant to the discussion. So I hadn't heard about that, so that's kind of the reason I didn't bring it up. I hadn't heard that. So I kind of did some quick Googling a little bit into that to try to figure out the background. And I don't think, from what I read, that the Ukrainian government has ever threatened to destroy the bridge across the Kerch Strait. What I read is that there was a Ukrainian politician, a minister of parliament named, I'm gonna butcher his name, so I apologize in advance. His name is Ihor Moseichuk. That's what I want to say it is, and he's a member of a radical. Well, it's called the Radical Party of Ola Lyashko, and apparently that's a nationalist/populist political party. And like a lot of nationalist populists in Ukraine, he's hawkish on the whole conflict with Russia. So he suggested that Ukraine should attack the bridge because it was the infrastructure of an enemy that they were in conflict with. And that was a statement he made in November, this past November. There was also an older statement made in an editorial in the Washington Examiner, apparently. An editorial made back in July, I think, or May, maybe, in which the writer suggested that Ukraine should attack the bridge to signal to Russia that Ukraine would not accept the annexation of Crimea, basically to try to send a signal that they were not going to normalize relations, that they would not accept that. So that's what I found from Googling. So it's not the case that the Ukrainian government threatened to destroy the bridge, but rather an individual politician did, a very hawkish one at that. And also apparently this article from the Examiner, but nothing official from the Ukrainian government per se. It's pretty normal for ministers of parliament, hawkish ministers of parliament, to kind of issue cheap talk like that. You know, you can see that in the United States too. John McCain used to do it a fair amount. And the example I found for Russia is the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia. The old joke being that it's neither liberal nor democratic. The dude's name is Zhirinovsky. It's a very technical name, I know, dude. Don't have his first name, though. He sent a letter not long ago to Eastern European leaders advocating for the partition of Ukraine in specific regions that would be given basically a plebiscite to break away from Ukraine. So, you know, it's not unusual for politicians at different levels of government to kind of just talk shit, basically. It's pretty normal, but it's not really considered the official platform of the government. It's not coming from the executive branch, per se, or something high level like that. So I wanted to kind of issue that clarification. That's why I didn't bring it up, basically. I didn't know it, and that's the background I was able to find on it. For those in Ukraine or Russia who kind of know more about it or have context, definitely, you know, pitch in and chat there. Your elaboration would be welcome in that regard. Let's see. Okay, so now back to the questions. Let's see. So we did the first one. Okay, do you think there's going to be an actual shift in the U.S.-Saudi relationship now that Democrats are somewhat more keyed into the issue because of its anti-Trump framing? I don't think so. I don't really think so, because I don't think most people just don't care about foreign policy. It's just not sexy, unless there's like a big war like Iraq or something. Most people don't pay that much attention. So just even as a basic political maneuver, in order to bring pressure against the administration or take advantage of anti-Trump sentiment, it's not like really great politics. They're not going to get like they're not going to make a lot of hay out of that, so to speak. You get a lot of advantage. Yeah, and substantively, again, you know, the foreign policy apparatus of the United States is kind of for better, decent, at least, relations with Saudi Arabia because they are a partner nation in the region. You know, and there's not a lot of alternatives in the region for that matter. So just practically speaking, I fully expect that any legislative action to be largely superficial and symbolic. And pretty much that's what it's been thus far. And I don't think the Democrats are going to push for more substantive change beyond that. There might be some hearings, you know, they might complain a bit, but I don't think substantively they'll do anything different or really put a lot of pressure on the administration to do anything different. Yeah, it's just not really a political winner. You know, they'll do a little bit with it, I think, for a while, but they'll probably move on. Again, most Americans are not that keyed into foreign policy to begin with.
Yeah, it's the appeal to the greatest number of people's emotions that's going to be winning you favor with the country. I mean, yeah, you can have a really awesome mapped out plan of how to interact with some country moving forward, but a lot of people are like, what is that country? Why should we care? How does that affect my life?
Yeah.
Normally it's about who can say freedom and justice first. How many times can you say America in values and liberty and stuff like that? It's the buzzwords.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, it's Saudi Arabia, so it's not like there was really... people had a really high opinion of their human rights record to begin with. Yeah, it's kind of a deal with the devil sort of thing. You know, there's a lack of partners in the region. The United States government wants to be there for strategic reasons. And, you know, you can kind of... there's an argument to be made that maybe the United States shouldn't be there or shouldn't be as involved in Middle Eastern politics. You know, there's a spectrum of policy options there that you can kind of debate. But for the moment, there's a kind of consensus that the United States has enough interests in the Middle East to warrant a presence, and that if it's going to have a presence, it needs partners, and that the GCC nations are the principal partners the U.S. has. And so you just kind of put up with their issues, such as they are, in exchange for having strong partners in the region. Also, there's the oil. You know, this oil's a sensitive resource, and the Saudis control a big chunk of the market, so they're a very attractive partner in that regard as well. Yeah, so there's just a lot of obstacles to really substantively changing the relationship, structurally speaking, beyond just being upset about the Saudis' human rights record. Let's see. What are your thoughts on the censorship of certain demographics of the internet by Google? I'm not a tech guy. That's kind of more of a Kukio question. Haven't said that in a while, have we? Yeah, that's a Kukio question. He would have been able to answer that really well, but I'm not that familiar with the whole issue.
I'm not sure what exactly they're talking about. Like what has been
There is
censored?
I think they're referring more to censorship, perceived censorship of conservative ideas on social media. But I think Google's kind of been accused of it too, because there was there was actually a hearing recently, and there was there was a conservative politician who was kind of complaining about Google, how he Googled his name and only negative stuff came up. And so somebody I think a Democrat in the hearing actually Googled him live on air and read him out loud. And his kind of counterpoint was that if you don't want bad results, then do good things.
Yeah, I was gonna say that that isn't really a political thing, is it? Like if you're a person
Well,
who's done stuff that upsets people, that's the news that's out for you.
well, that's the question. I mean, to what is Google kind of manipulating the results such that disproportionately negative articles and reporting are returned? Or alternatively, is it just that those are the types of stories that come up when you take certain action? So, you know, the conservative argument is that Google is kind of engaging in shady business, and that kind of ties into the overarching turn in public opinion against tech companies that's been occurring over the past, year or two. But then the counterpoint, the counter argument is that no, they're not doing that, and that it's just kind of people complaining about bad press because they're doing this, that, or the other policy issue, promoting this, that, or the other policy.
I think Chad is saying stuff about maybe this guy was alt-right.
It wouldn't surprise me. It is more of an issue on that side of the political spectrum. I haven't really heard that argument as much from the political left, although from the political left there's an equivalent, which is complaining about social media monopolies. I think that's something that they kind of hit on more, and concerns about data privacy and whatnot. So that's kind of more the left equivalent. On the right, they've been focusing more on this perceived censorship issue. Again, I don't know enough about it myself to really have a strong statement there. I would have to kind of do more reading on that, kind of comment more.
There's definitely the potential for exploiting the way that search engines work. That's the power that they wield, is they can shift what floats to the top and what doesn't, and I would say your average user has no idea how that works. So
Yeah.
for it to be filtered in a way that they're not aware of is pretty easy to slip in. But yeah, the issue in question being a political one, and if it's alt-right stuff, then I feel like that may explain why there are negative things about a person.
Could be.
It's 2018. Racism isn't really a badge of honor to wear. It gets you in trouble.
Yeah, so I'm not sure there. I would have to do more reading. But let's see. Is it a big deal that the Dow is closing 2018 close to or below where it opened, or is that just white noise in the market? So again, I'll preface this by saying that I'm not a finance guy, throwing that out there again, but I don't know that it is too big a deal, because the stock market has become a little bit detached from economic reality over the past 10, 15 years. Part of that is because of all the quantitative easing that the central banks have been doing, not only in the United States, but like around the world. That's led to a big flood of money into financial markets, as well as other sundry markets, but stock markets in particular. So there's a bunch of money sloshing around, and the result is that stock markets are probably overinflated to begin with, kind of regardless of what the Trump administration has been doing. Although the Trump administration's tax stimulus, the stimulus effect that the Trump administration's tax reform had probably boosted it even more. So there is some suspicion that stock markets around the world, in the U.S. in particular, are kind of on steroids at the moment. So I don't really read too much into the ebb and flow in the stock market. It doesn't really reflect too much what's going in the real economy, so to speak. It does to a degree. It's still useful as a kind of a signaler. You can kind of see where the money's going, where markets perceive opportunities, that kind of thing. But in terms of a broad reading of the economy, I wouldn't really lean on stock markets too much. Not really the best indicator these days. Let's see. Excuse me. Assuming the increase in automation is going to continue to take more jobs in the U.S., increasingly so considering the recent advancements in robotics and technology, what is the economic future of the U.S. if millions are out of jobs essentially due to being replaced by automated processes that are far faster and more efficient than manual labor? That's the big question. We actually used to talk about this a lot. Way back when we started the stream.
Mm-hmm.
People kind of stopped asking after a while, but I'll see if I can't conjure some of what I said back then, because I probably gave better answers back then, since I kind of haven't thought about this in a while. For one, the question implicitly assumes that there will not be new jobs created to kind of counterbalance the loss in jobs from automation. That's sort of the textbook economist's answer. There's going to be new jobs to replace the old ones, so don't worry about it too much. But the person who asked this question specifically asked, what if millions are thrown out of their jobs? So I'll assume then that there are not new jobs created by automation and robotization and whatnot. In that case, then you're going to have a political problem, to put it mildly. At that point, it's not going to be a specifically economic problem. It's going to be political, and there's going to be, the political system will have to find some way to manage that. I would assume that there would be a lot of demand for political action at that point. Once it reaches that level where there's millions of people out of work with no prospect of alternative work, invariably there would have to be some kind of political reckoning, because they're going to demand the government help them out somehow, most likely, I would expect. It's not inevitable. I would have to expect the U.S. to be the exception on that count.
In plain language, people need to get to a critical mass of upset.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. But I was going to say, in the U.S., our political culture is very averse to government assistance, so the U.S. could kind of see less of that. The effect could be mitigated here, if only because of that. But if it's sufficiently bad, it could be even here. There would be a lot of demand for government action of some kind. I don't know if that would take the form of government subsidies, like a minimum income or something like that, or if maybe it would be something more dramatic or structural change of some kind. One of the interesting things, sorry, I got the mic away from my face. One of the interesting things that the Trump administration kind of represents is a kind of American solution to that problem, because we've already kind of seen some of that with the disruption to traditional livelihoods caused by automation and international trade in the manufacturing sector. And a lot of those people have trouble finding new careers that pay them as much as the careers they used to have. And so they, in the United States, a lot of people have been very averse to government assistance to try to help with that. They've kind of tolerated government funding to training programs, but there hasn't been like a guaranteed minimum income or anything like that. What is the technical name of that? I think I'm tripping over that.
Universal basic income?
That's the one. Thank you. Universal basic income. That hasn't really come up much in the U.S., and I don't really think it will, probably.
But there was that one guy.
There was that one guy.
It's like, this is my jam.
Yeah, this is my jam.
UBI
there are people
is the
who want
future.
it. But I think there's going to be more just structural opposition to it, just because of American political culture.
He won off all the poor college students. That sounds really good to me.
But instead of doing that, it seems like Trump supporters in particular, in so much as they're an avatar for the kind of people who have seen their livelihoods disrupted from international trade and automation, the solution those people prefer is basically to change the structure of international trade such that the free market basically to manipulate the free market such that the type of jobs that they're good at are the ones that kind of benefit. So there's no direct government assistance per se, but there's actually indirect government assistance in so much as they're providing more protection for the manufacturing sector and more indirect subsidies through the manipulation of international relations. So basically trying to create an environment where they can say that they're working in a free market, but where the free market itself that's being created where they can have those jobs again is kind of artificially induced almost. So they kind of get to have their cake and eat it too. It's still technically free market, so they can still technically say that they're not getting government assistance, but the government kind of has its hand in creating that environment in the first place. It's a distinctly American solution. It kind of fits with our culture here. And it may be that if this scenario the questioner mentions, where there's millions of people out of work because of automation, it may be that something like that, only bigger, becomes the solution. But we've talked before about how long run predictions are basically always wrong. They're just really hard to predict. it's really hard to predict what happens in the long run because there's so many uncertainties and so many variables that you can't account for. So that's kind of my prediction there is just completely open to scrutiny. You know, it could very easily be anything else. But yeah, that's my read on it anyway.
What is the most American solution to this problem?
Bald eagles.
Send in the eagles.
Lord of the Rings style Deus Ex Machina bald eagles. What are your thoughts? Alright, where was... Okay, next one was, do you think Fukushima will shape the future of countries near the Pacific Ocean due to the radiation destroying the ocean? I had not realized it was destroying the ocean, so that's a new one on me. I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying I'm not familiar with that. I haven't read anything about that. So unfortunately that means I can't really comment on the question, because I don't know anything about that. But thank you for letting me know. That's something I can Google and research later. Yeah, I had thought that they kind of had the radiation contamination under control at Fukushima. That was my impression, but I haven't been following it, so I don't really know. And, you know, it's not like the government doesn't have an incentive to kind of manipulate that, so maybe that they're kind of covering that up to some degree. Yeah, I don't know. I would have to read more. Let's see. What is your favorite period in history? I don't really have one. Oh, that's a lie. It's World War II. Yeah. I mean, I dabble in a lot of different periods, but World War II is kind of the one I always come back to. Just because there's always something new to learn, and I've already kind of read a fair amount, so it's kind of interesting to learn something new with something that you're familiar with already.
There was a lot of shit going on at that point.
Yeah, put it mildly. Yeah, World War II was kind of the first big history thing I got interested in as a kid. You know, the first big historical event. So that's got a special place, I guess. Your first is always special. Let's see. How are current political powers in the U.S. affecting the future of healthcare here, at least economically, if that's what you're comfortable with? Political powers. I'm not sure what you mean by current political powers. Healthcare here in the U.S. is a mess. You know, Obamacare was a compromise bill, and like a lot of compromise bill, it's not terribly functional, and it's only become more dysfunctional as subsequent administrations and Congresses have tried to kind of pick it apart. So it was a mediocre legislation that's kind of mutated into even worse legislation with time. Yeah, there's going to have to be some kind of comprehensive reform effort there at some point, but right now there's just not enough political consensus for any one type of solution to really get a good, solid, well-rounded reform through. Like, you could do like a full free market reform, you could do like one payer, I mean, just something. But because there's such a balance between different factions, it's hard for any one solution to get through. So you end up with compromise bills like the Obamacare bill. And I don't know that we could do a lot better at this point, given all the partisanship. So that may be something we're stuck with for the short to medium term. I did read that maybe this is what this person is referring to. There was a judge in Texas that actually ruled that Obamacare was unconstitutional. And that's going to the Supreme Court for sure. It's pretty much inevitable. The crux of the ruling, the argumentation was that because last year Congress basically got rid of the mandate. And what basically, for those not familiar with Obamacare, part of what made Obamacare financially viable was that there was a mandate that people had to buy healthcare. And it was kind of sort of, it wasn't really a mandate, it was actually a tax technically. Basically, if you did not buy healthcare and you did not meet certain exceptions, then you had to pay a tax penalty. So if you had an income under a certain amount, you didn't have to do it, but most people would have to buy healthcare, and they didn't. They got stuck with that penalty. So what the Republican Congress did last year is they got rid of the penalty. So technically there's still a mandate, but the penalty for not adhering to it is $0. So basically they got rid of it then. And the judge in Texas that I mentioned argues that because there's no more mandate, then the whole bill should be scrubbed, that the whole thing is basically illegal, unconstitutional. And from what I've read, from what little I read, basically just a BBC article and a CS Monitor article, I think, the legal expert, quote unquote, that they quoted said that the reasoning was not very strong and that the judgment would probably be struck down by the Supreme Court. So the bill's probably not going anywhere. Obamacare will probably survive this challenge. But affecting the political powers, affecting the future of healthcare here. If you're talking about like political preferences and political groups, then it is just that partisanship and that disagreement that's kind of preventing a definitive reform effort. So I guess I kind of already said that. So yeah, I would ask for some elaboration on what's meant by current political powers. But I think I kind of covered that question. If I ever don't cover your question the way you want, your satisfactorily, or if I miss something because I'm stupid and sometimes I misread questions, feel free to ask again and I'll be happy to return to it. How is Amazon affecting the U.S. economy? Are major businesses suffering, and what will happen with them if so? That's a good question. I would need to read research. I would need to read the relevant literature to get into that, because that's very much a data question. I know that Amazon benefits disproportionately because they don't pay as much taxes than brick and mortar stores. You know, basically, Amazon competes with traditional established physical stores, but they have kind of an advantage because they're online and they're not subject to the same array of taxes that an actual physical store is. But I don't know enough about the data of the retail industry to know whether or not that the major big box stores are really getting hit significantly. I know there's a hit, but I don't know if you can call it statistically significant, which is why I would want to look at the data. Let's see. But they definitely do have a competitive advantage by being just an online company. Let's see. How is Amazon affecting the U.S. economy? That's a big picture question. That's much broader. I would say that it's, at the very least, it's shifting commerce onto the internet. That's the obvious answer. And then obviously the fallout would be the impact on the brick and mortar stores, which I just talked about. You could argue that they're kind of propagating the gig economy, in so much as a lot of their jobs are sort of temp work at warehouses and factories and whatnot. I don't know that you could say they're affecting the U.S. economy so much as they're a part of a trend. You know, we talk a lot on here about structural economic change and how that's kind of the defining trait of our era. What's kind of driving the history and politics of our era. And one of the manifestations of that is sort of the Amazon warehouse style temp job. You know, that's kind of where we're going. Because there's so much automation and so much efficiency that you can kind of have big economies of scale like that with relatively few workers. And so there's more and more incentive to have sort of these cheap, low-wage workers who kind of do the little things that you kind of can't automate. So there's been a lot of shift towards jobs like that. They're not really concentrated, though. That's the thing. You know, you can see that in the manufacturing sector and the services sector, but because there's no one factory in which everybody kind of goes to now, it's kind of hard to organize labor in the same way that factory workers used to. You know, it's like a couple of guys work at the McDonald's, a couple of guys work at the Amazon warehouse, a couple of guys work at you know, the frozen yogurt place. Like workers are distributed much more widely and have much more disparate interests, and it's much harder to organize them as a result. That's part of the reason wages are kind of stagnating. And that's a whole topic of discussion in and of itself. So I would say that, in part, my answer to this question is that Amazon is not so much affecting the economy as it is a symptom of broader forces that are affecting the economy. Will movements like the Yellow Jacket movement incite exits from the European Union like Brexit? I would argue no, because I don't think a lot of countries really want to leave the European Union. I think most people are pretty comfortable with where the European Union is at now. Most of the dissatisfaction with the EU is actually one of two things. One, they're concerned about further centralization, and so they want to stop that. The other thing is kind of conflating difficult economic circumstances in Europe with the European Union bureaucracy. European Union bureaucracy does not help the economy in Europe, but it's not as bad as a lot of people kind of paint it, I think. You know, that you could definitely argue that it's overburdensome, but it also does actually provide an economic benefit because it homogenizes different standards across different countries, and that reduces barriers to trade. Like if every country has their own different standards, that kind of makes it tricky to invest, because then you kind of have to worry about all the different standards and legal implications. It's a lot easier if everybody has the same standard, and then you can just sell to all the different countries without really having to think about it too hard. So there is a benefit to it in that sense. I'm not saying that that benefit justifies all the costs. That's kind of a subjective read that depends on individual political preferences. People can kind of decide that for themselves. But I would say that there's not really enough discontent with the European Union to propel nations to leave, at least right now. And you know, the Yellow Jacket movement itself in France is really more about the economy. You know, there's just not a lot of opportunities. There's a lack of good wages. A lot of that comes down to structural changes in the economy, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that. You can try, but it's going to be like, what's it? You know what a Chinese finger trap is, Neuro?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like that. And, you know, with structural changes, the more you fight them, the more difficult your circumstances become, basically. You know, you kind of have to take a defter approach to it. I don't know that there's any one good solution that's going to be satisfactory. More likely, we're going to end up with a series of temporary compromises that don't really satisfy anybody, and then eventually the current generation will die off and be replaced by a new generation that's more acclimated to new economic conditions. And they won't complain as much because they're just used to it. That's probably the likely long-term equilibrium we're moving towards, I would guess. Again, that's just a big guess on my part. But I don't really think there's any one thing you can do, and definitely leaving the European Union isn't going to solve anything, really. It might satisfy some political demands, but I don't think, economically speaking, it really resolves any of the fundamental issues driving discontent in Europe, in so much as they are economic in nature, anyway. Even the UK leaving the European Union is not really about the economy. You know, it's not like the Yellow Jacket movement. It's more about immigration in the UK's case. There was a lot of discontent about that in the lead up to the Brexit referendum. And that kind of had to do with Britain not being able to deport certain radicals that the European Court of Justice was not allowing them to deport, because they would have been deported into countries where there was torture, which the European Court of Justice does not really allow. So I think that was kind of more the crux of Brexit. If you're British and listening, feel free to chip in, because you guys probably have more context to the reasons why you guys voted to leave. But that's my understanding of it anyway. It's more social issues than economic issues, like in France right now. Let's see, so can we get a Brexit update? And if it is a hard Brexit, how fucked is their economy?
How hard is this Brexit right now?
How hard is this Brexit right now? So actually the answer is nobody knows, because the status of UK politics right now is pretty much absolute fucked. There's a lot of confusion right now. There's a lack of political consensus on any one solution, be it a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, a mildly softer Brexit, a mildly harder Brexit. Like, there's no consensus on anything, and so there's a lot of scrambling for position to try to build enough support to do something and to have some kind of deal in place before the UK crashes out of the European Union in March. So there's a lot of drama right now. There was supposed to be a vote in Parliament on the deal that Theresa May signed, well, not signed, but negotiated with the European Union, but she actually delayed that because she didn't think she had enough votes for it. And right now there's a lot of hemming and hawing and arguing in Parliament about how to kind of manage things going forward. It's unclear. Situation in doubt, let's put it like that. It's not even clear if Theresa May will be able to stay on as Prime Minister. There could be another election, there could be another referendum. Like, it's anybody's guess right now. It's totally in the air. One thing I did read is that Theresa May delay the vote in Parliament until the last possible minute, basically, in the hope that that will generate support for the deal she negotiated. Because if there's not enough time to renegotiate a new deal, it may be just impossible to crash out of the European Union. If Parliament rejects her deal with only like a week left before they crash out, that may not be enough time to negotiate something new. So in that case, Parliament may vote to support her deal even though they don't like it, just to avoid that inevitability. So there may be some real politic on the part of Theresa May going on there, if that is what she's trying to do.
Professor, I have a relevant meme.
Oh, yeah?
Yes. Did you know that Theresa May does an amazing Gollum impression?
Does she?
She does. It's amazing. It's I would say, yeah. You know, from Lord of the Rings?
Who is that?
Theresa May.
No, Gollum.
Have you seen the Lord of the Rings movies? Smeagol?
Smeagol?
Oh, man.
Oh, that guy. Gollum.
Gollum. The precious. That guy.
I gotcha.
Okay, I put it in the Twitch chat and in the Agent Smith chat. You can watch that at your leisure.
Oh my god.
We don't need to.
Thumbnail.
We don't need to watch it right now, but that's your homework assignment.
I'm tempted.
It's pretty funny.
That is pretty striking. But yeah, that is kind of my impression of where Brexit is right now. Lord of the Rings references aside, and we'll kind of see where it goes. It's they're doing a bunch of stuff behind the scenes and negotiating and whatnot. So I don't really have a lot to update from last week. The update last week was kind of the real update. That kind of got you up to speed as far as negotiations over the past month or so. But since then, it's been just kind of a wild ride. Everything's all over the place. Again, if you're British and listening, I welcome your input because I don't want to be wrong. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So please do correct me on any of the stuff that I may be getting wrong. Definitely don't want to misinform anybody. Let's see. How are we doing? Yellow Jackets, Brexit update. Does eugenics contribute positively to Chinese citizens, or is it used as a form of controlling the birth rates of those deemed undesirable by the government? I don't think they engage in eugenics in China. I haven't read anything to that effect. I know that there was, actually you may have heard of this, Neuro, there was that guy, that Chinese scientist who announced that he had genetically engineered a baby, that he modified the DNA of an embryo, and that the parents were going to give birth to it. Had you heard that?
Yeah.
That was a big
That's one of the things about hullabaloo. If one thing happens, a lot of times people will say, is this going to be the norm now?
Yeah.
If there was one instance. So we have this is kind of unrelated, but it's a similar example. In Blizzard, the company, one of the games, Heroes of the Storm, got a bunch of its funding cut pretty substantially. And the StarCraft scene has been up in arms saying, are we doomed? Is this the end? Is this the sign of the apocalypse kind of a thing? But it was a pretty basic assessment, and it was one example of the game's numbers weren't performing well enough to justify that level of investment from the company, but it doesn't apply to how well StarCraft is doing. We've grown over the past year, so there isn't really any reason to worry. But because there is an instance that is, it's palatable, it's new, it's exciting, people are really worried about if that's going to happen to us. So no, I don't know too much about this guy who designed an embryo in China, but yeah, I think it's a kind of human, what is the word, alarmism?
Yeah.
Sound the alarm! Someone did a thing!
Yeah.
Oh god.
There was a big shitstorm about it because a bunch of scientists said, oh, that's very unethical, you're not supposed to do that, and the Chinese government came out and said, actually, that's unethical even here, you're not supposed to do that. So they said they would launch an investigation, but I haven't heard anything about it since then. We'll see. He seems pretty solid on it. And he seems very confident when he talked about it and saying that he did it. It's so I don't know that it's a hoax, basically, is what I'm saying. Because there's been hoaxes like that before. Actually, I could tell do you remember, you might remember this, Neuro, but this was a long time ago. This is way back when we were in college. Probably before, I think this was when I was an undergrad even, maybe. But there was actually this cult in like the western US. No, it was California, I think. There was a cult in California that actually announced that they had had a gene. What do you call it? A gene-edited baby.
Mm-hmm.
They had genetically modified an embryo or something like that. Something to that effect. They came out and had a big news conference about it, and the media was all there, and everybody was like, "Oh wow, did they actually do that?" And then it came out like a week or two later, like, "Oh no, they totally didn't do that. It was all just publicity for the cult that they were in." Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff.
Join us. We do things no one else is doing. We promise.
The media bit hard, so they definitely got their advertising. But the impression I got is that this guy was not like that. At least that's what I read anyway. There was kind of a sense that maybe he was the real deal. We'll see what happens when the investigation ends. Assuming we ever hear about it again. I don't know, maybe they just disappear him, who's to say. Let's see. So, yeah, I don't think China does eugenics. I've never read anything to that effect. Let's see. What do you think it will take to catalyze a global or domestic U.S. action on climate change? Seems like some issue burst into salience unexpectedly, and I'm wondering what it's going to take on this one to break through the partisan gridlock. Probably nothing.
Well,
I think...
If I could take a stab, there are a lot of different signs of climate change, such as a lot of these natural disasters increasing in number and scale. And like we said before, it has to reach a critical mass of grumpy before people are forced to admit it. And we're not there yet. So California, unfortunately, it needs to be on fire more than it is now, which it's already on fire. And we've got to have higher temperatures year to year. We have to have more tornadoes. The flooding and the hurricanes and stuff have to continue to get worse to a point where it's like, is this the apocalypse?
Yeah.
And then at that point, it becomes harder and harder to deny. So I think we are moving in the range of a lot of people are saying, okay, well, maybe climate change is real, but is it human caused? So some people are taking that step back, which it does reflect an overall shift. It's not a unanimous agreement yet. We're still pretty far off that, but things have to continue to get a lot worse. And the thing about climate change is a lot of people don't really see any direct effects, but as more and more people have their livelihood affected by climate change, then that becomes more of a major talking point for them. Because I think, say when Al Gore ran for president, I think he was saying climate change was a really major part of his platform. And at that point, your average person was kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever, Mr. I invented the internet guy. And they totally wrote it off as not even an issue. I think I remember for me personally, yeah, I was aware that climate change was a thing, but I hadn't really seen any of the direct danger and damage to the world. Whereas Great Barrier Reef is one of the really kind of picturesque examples that makes us sad. Of, wow, that was a really beautiful place, and it's just a rip. It's dead.
Yeah, my argument would be kind of in a similar vein. I don't think anything's going to be done preemptively, basically. More likely it's going to be more about adjusting to the changes as they happen. So I think adaptation will be the buzzword and the principal policy going forward rather than preventing the rise of global temperatures, global warming. I might add that I'm not a climate scientist. I'm about as far as you can get, so I really don't know a lot about that issue. So I'm definitely not the best person to ask, but if I had to guess, I would say, politically speaking, yeah, it's probably going to have to wait until things get catastrophic in terms of substantive action. And, you know, maybe there's a consensus later on, but I suspect adaptation policies will be much more popular and acceptable than preventive policies decades in advance. Yeah, there's just a lot of suspicion. I mean, part of the problem is that the issue has been politicized, so there's not much trust, like even of the scientific community now, because there's a sense they've kind of been infiltrated or coerced or influenced or whatever. And that lack of trust makes it very difficult to kind of communicate and build a consensus. So I doubt that there's going to be a lot of traction there. I mean, even with the climate talks, there's not really a lot of traction. I mean, if you look at the agreements that are made, a lot of them are really soft, and they're not really binding or have any punishments or anything. So, you know, even at the international level, not a whole lot is being done. That's the principal thing I've been reading about this recent, the current, actually it's still ongoing. There's a current climate conference going on, or maybe it just ended. But the most recent climate conference this past week, a lot of people were saying that, you know, they weren't really going to be able to get what they wanted. They were just trying to do as best they could. And they were saying that the agreement would not really meet the need of the hour, would not really be enough to meet the threat, but that it was better than nothing. But yeah, that's kind of my reading on it. I'm not really. I doubt that there will be a lot done in the near to medium term, would be my prediction. We'll see what happens. And there could be changes in the science, too. I mean, it's still a pretty new science, so there could easily be new revelations, new findings, etc., that are either more or less convincing, one way or the other, in the argument, so that could help, too. You know, it wasn't so long ago that, what was it? I think it was back in the 80s. The ozone layer was going to disintegrate. Was that what it was?
Mm-hmm.
Something to that effect. And then kind of a couple decades later, it didn't fix itself per se, but it did kind of come back to some degree. I guess, of course, you could argue that was because of the environmental measures taken in that time interval, but debatable. But anyway, the point is, things change. We'll see. There could be new data, new information going forward that will make things more clear going forward, and that could have a role in the political discussion. Let's see. What do you see as the primary, or future, if that's easier, problem with the U.S. political system? People. It's the people. And I don't mean the politicians, I mean the voters. You know, it's kind of reminds me of the old saying we have here in the U.S., guns don't kill people, people kill people. Political systems don't ruin nations, people ruin nations through political systems. I mean, any political system can be successful if you have the right people. You know, so long as expectations are set and met, people can kind of manage, even under the worst political systems. They can kind of get by. So the political systems start to break down when the people start to reject their legitimacy, or they try to exploit them, or whatever. And there's generally some catalyst for discontent that starts to destabilize them. So, you know, whatever problems people have with the structure of the U.S. government, there probably would not be problems that could not be managed if not for the underlying social tension in the United States between different groups of one sort or another. That change and tension that's emerged over the past few decades is really what's driving political issues. And if you could resolve that, then the political system would kind of take care of itself, and that wouldn't be a problem. But as is, that's looking unlikely in the short to medium term. I mean, there's the racial politics, there's the issue coming from structural economic change, and the destruction of traditional livelihoods from structural economic change, and the churn and disruption that causes, the shift from one type of economy to another. And then there's just urbanization. You know, rural people have their own basically their own culture that's very distinctive from urban American culture. And even urban American culture has a bunch of subcultures that don't really get along. You know, that whole process of economic and social evolution is driving political tensions, and it's not clear how that's going to be resolved anytime soon. Maybe if there was some elevation of consciousness in which people knew that they needed to have more compromise and knew that they couldn't really use the political system to bludgeon their opponents into submission. If we could kind of reach that degree of enlightenment, that would help a lot, but that's a moonshot at this point. It's probably going to take a while.
Hey, do we win to the moon? At least allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah. Allegedly. It's all shot in a studio, supposedly. Yeah, that's a whole problem, though. I mean, I don't know how you resolve that underlying tension. I'm sure there's some little things you could do to change the structure of the political system to maybe ease tensions, but I don't think it would really work substantively. You know, you could change it to a representative legislature, a representative voting system. You change the electoral system, but I mean, fundamentally, people are going to be pissed off no matter what. Some large group of people is going to be wicked pissed no matter what you do at this point, because there's just too many disparate interests and disparate perspectives to be easily reconciled. You really just need a common recognition of democratic norms and a common recognition of a new set of norms, political norms. Because the old set of norms kind of withered under the pressure of all those social and political changes. And what we need now is, one, a new set of political norms, and then for those political norms to be widely accepted and understood by broader society. I think that's kind of the real solution. And I think we'll kind of move in that direction. I think part of the reason we have the problems now is because of the information revolution. A lot of people now who were not before involved in politics are kind of involved in politics because they have an urbanization and economic development gives people the resources to have access to that technology through which they can be more involved in politics to a greater degree than ever before. So basically, we just have more political mobilization enabled by technological change and economic development than ever before. And that's creating new strains. That's kind of creating this new tension in part. And I think the information revolution will also be the solution to that problem, because over time, people will see how people will see that the current method of interacting and trying to abuse the democratic institutions doesn't work, that it just leads to gridlock. And over time, people will see that through the internet and through the information revolution and the institutions thereof. We'll kind of see that, and eventually the culture will adjust over time to embrace new democratic norms that will allow a new equilibrium in which there can be new political consensuses, new political understandings that smooth over a lot of the rougher edges that are very manifest right now. I think that's going to be a long-term process, though, so I think we're in for a bumpy couple of decades until that kind of plays out. And again, long-run predictions are pretty much bullshit. You just can't know what's going to happen, and there's all kinds of new stuff that happens and new uncontrolled variables, blah, blah, blah. So that's just a random prediction on my part. That's a guess on my part. You can kind of make of it what you will, take it or leave it. But that would be my uninformed guess at this point. So that would be my view of what's fundamentally wrong with the U.S. political system. And I know that's not an entirely satisfactory answer, because I suspect you were probably wanting more of like an institutional change. How can we change the electoral system or the voting system or what have you, or the Constitution?
Agent Smith knows this one simple trick that politicians don't want you to know.
Politicians hate Agent Smith's solution to this problem. Yeah, clickbaity type stuff. No, there's nothing like that. There's no silver bullet for that. I don't think anything would do it. I could be wrong, maybe there is. I'm not a political scientist. But that's certainly my impression. I don't think you're going to be able to put this to bed. I don't think anybody's going to wake up one day and be like, "Oh, of course, we just need to do this," and everything is gravy.
Watch someone wake up and say, "Oh, we just need to do this," and then it's gravy, and you were wrong.
Could be. That's the kind of thing you want to be wrong about, though. I wouldn't mind being wrong on. That would be nice if we could kind of get out of this era. Politics is a little too interesting right now in the United States. I kind of miss the old boring politics. Back when politics was watching one of those boring political shows on a Sunday afternoon, that kind of politics.
C-SPAN, yeah.
Yeah, you didn't really appreciate it at the time back in the day, but compared to now, that's much preferable. Did you answer the question? Any questions about the Irish backstop? If not, could you talk about what happens to the border in Ireland with regard to the EU if the UK leaves with no deal? We actually did. I did get a question about it last week, and I kind of went into it a bit. But I don't think I talked specifically about what would happen to the border if there was a hard crash out of the European Union. And I don't know exactly what would happen in that case. Presumably there would be border checks, customs checks, the whole range of border stuff that you would have between two countries without any kind of trade deal. And that would basically break the Good Friday Agreement provisions about having an open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So if that happens, I don't know. Northern Ireland as a violent conflict has not really been in the news in a long time because it's been really quiet. But I don't really know how militant groups would respond to the breaking of the Good Friday Agreement. Relations right now in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants are already not great because there's actually been this political stonewalling going on that's prevented the formation of a regional government. I think part of the Good Friday Agreement was the UK devolving power to Northern Ireland so they could have their own devolved government, which is basically a fancy way of saying regional government. But the Unionists have not really been gung-ho on it. And there was some disagreement that prompted the Unionists to basically blow it up and prevent the formation of new government. And as a result, the UK has basically been directly ruling Northern Ireland since then. It's been like a year, 2 years now. Somebody from the UK, please correct me on this. But that issue has been creating some tensions there. It hasn't gotten violent again, for which everybody is grateful, but it's not clear if a hard border and the potential collapse of the Good Friday Agreement might tip things back into violent territory. That's not clear. If you're asking more about the economic side of it, then it's just border checks. There'll be border checks again, customs checks, and etc. I mean, honestly, it wouldn't have to be too disruptive. It kind of depends on how they implement it. But nominally, that would be the case, since technically there would be no legal grounding to have no checks there. She really does look like him, doesn't she?
It's just Andy Serkis, dude.
Let's see. I think that's it for questions. How are we on time?
Oh, we're good. I'm good going for an hour if you want to.
Oh, cool. Okay. Normally when we run out of questions, that means we're running out of time. Okay, so we had a bunch from last week we didn't get to, so we can kind of go back to that. Ooh. Let's see, where did we leave off exactly? Here we go. Okay, let me get a drink of water real quick. Since European countries are small and have used up most of their natural resources and hold mostly a cultural / intellectual / post-colonial wealth advantage on the developing world, is it inevitable that the EU will start to be economically swallowed by other regions in the world? I don't think so. Let me read the question again real quick so I can get all the angles here. Small, used up, hold mostly cultural. Yeah. No, I don't think so, because I think European industry is wealth in and of itself. So even if they don't have a lot of the same resources or there's a lot of economic pressure, European industry is still very strong and has that strong first mover advantage. It'll be very difficult for big automotive companies to come up and really, in say Africa or India, to kind of really challenge European companies because they do have that big edge. They're global companies more so than European companies. So they have that institutional and cultural edge that comes from being rooted in a country and political system that is basically built around them. Major corporations in the West and modern Western political institutions kind of developed and evolved together. And so they kind of are more symbiotic than in other regions of the world, where political institutions are a little more backwards and have trouble adapting to the needs and desires and pressures of major corporations. So Europe doesn't have to adjust to have a successful business environment, corporations, innovation, etc. Other parts of the world do, because they haven't really adapted the necessary legal frameworks, rule of law, soft institutions, norms, etc., that are kind of needed to really have a prosperous economy. So in that sense, I think Europe will continue to have an advantage. Even given the current pressure from the structural economic change on workers and whatnot, I think the overall economy will continue to kind of do all right. In the sense, well, let me put it this way, not the economy, but specific industries, large industries that Europe has a comparative advantage in, I suspect that they'll keep that comparative advantage. The economy as a whole might struggle a bit, and European labor is probably going to struggle a lot going forward. But the big companies, or maybe even the smaller companies in which Europe has the comparative advantage, I think they'll be okay. That's my suspicion anyway. Because they've got the first mover advantage, they've got a lot of human capital, they've got a good legal framework, they've got a lot of good advantages going for them to kind of keep them going. That's not to say that it could be something that happens. I mean, there may be some regulatory change that just breaks their back, or it may be that there's just so much political chaos that they can't really make money anymore, or something like that. But barring dramatic changes of that vein, I think they'll be all right. There'll be pressure, but I suspect that they'll continue doing okay. Let's see. What potential does China have to shake up the world economy? Is it in their interest to do so? They've already shaken up the world economy just by being a major economic power. I mean, just by having a large market, they've already shifted a lot of the market, the international market, kind of towards them. That in itself changes things significantly. When China was a small economy, I never read anything about pangolins being poached, that kind of thing. And that's to say nothing of like the more major changes like financial flows and, the pressure brought to bear on the, what would you call it, blue collar labor in developed economies. Such has been the massive impact of China that there's at least a perception that low-wage workers and blue-collar workers in the developed world have been kind of harmed by their very presence as an economic actor. So they've definitely already shaken things up. But what potential do they have to shake up in the future? I mean, so long as they keep growing as an economy and they'll continue to grow in importance correspondingly. And in turn, they'll continue to kind of shift the balance of power in the global economy and shift the flow of goods and services towards themselves. So long as they continue to grow, that'll happen. Maybe they don't continue to grow, in which case things kind of stagnate a bit, in which case, unclear in that case. But is it in their interest to do so? I mean, if you're asking me if they're purposely going to mess around with the structure of the global economy, they kind of have an interest in doing so. It kind of depends on the party's ambitions, though. I think right now they have a pretty limited capacity to manipulate the global economy. Obviously, they can, suppress wages and steal intellectual property and all that sort of thing. But full on changing. Well, for example, the United States has a lot of leverage it can generate by through sanctions, because its economy is so large and because the United States economy is so interconnected with so many other economies around the world. China does not have that degree of power yet. They kind of have it to a degree in East Asia, kind of regionally, but they don't have it globally yet. So in that sense, they're still kind of limited in how they can leverage their economic heft and use it, translate it into political leverage. Let's see, what was that? Oh, here we go. So in that sense, they don't have that much leverage. They can create international institutions, like the, what was it? They created like an Asian Development Bank, and then they had another one whose name I can never remember. I always think it starts with an R, but it actually doesn't. It's actually a free trade deal. But anyway, they can try to form free trade blocks, sign free trade deals with countries. They can try to form development banks, etc. Basically create global institutions through which they can kind of influence other countries. And they do kind of have an interest in that. That helps them get diplomatic support, for sundry whatever international issue they may want support for. It helps them get diplomatic support defensively. Part of the reason China hasn't been criticized as much for the whole Xinjiang Uyghur thing is because they kind of have that leverage in place. But I don't know that the Communist Party of China is so ambitious as to want it for aggressive purposes. I mean, you can point to the island issue, but that's kind of meh. Not that exciting. That's not really big aggression like it could be. They're not pouring over the border, invading Vietnam or something. It's not the same level. So they'll probably continue building institutions like that, but I think they'll have a pretty limited capacity to leverage it, and a limited motivation to do so as well. Part of the reason I say they have a limited capacity to leverage global institutions that they build is that there's alternatives. They're going to kind of compete with Western institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. And the reason that's important is because the whole kind of attraction to doing business with the Chinese government and Chinese global institutions is going to be that they don't come with strings attached. You know, the Chinese don't really ask you to have good human rights or to have a competitive market. They just say, hey, we want to lend you money for this, take it or leave it. And that's very appealing for countries that kind of struggle with corruption and where there's a lot of patronage and politicians are kind of looking for ways to embezzle money for their own purposes. The problem with that model, though, is that eventually you bankrupt your country, right? You can only take on so much debt for your country before people stop wanting to lend to you, even the Chinese. Like, you kind of see that with Pakistan right now. You know, Pakistan took on a bunch of debt from China, and they're not going to be able to pay it back because they haven't generated enough economic growth. And so they've gone back to China and say, hey, can you lend us more money to pay back the money we borrowed from you before? And the Chinese are kind of balking at that. They're not really interested in throwing good money after bad. Like, it's okay to borrow money to spend on an infrastructure project that Chinese companies will help build. That's money for China, Chinese state-owned enterprises, you know, that kind of helps them out. But just giving people money to pay back loans that they don't want to pay back, that's not nearly as attractive. You know, even the Chinese government doesn't just want to throw money away like that.
One of the things that you and I have gotten to talk about at great length with a couple friends we both know is the difference in cultural norms between China and the US, and how you're comparing an individualist culture to a collectivist culture. So a lot of it might seem very foreign, different, and strange from the American perspective, but for them that might be exactly what they're going for with the whole thing. And China's so big that they have a lot of stuff to worry about internally. So comparing it to the US is not even apples to oranges kind of a comparison.
Yeah, I mean, look at how dysfunctional U.S. politics is with 300 million people in the U.S. China has over 1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you subtract the population of the United States from the population of China, you would still have more than 1 billion people. That's how many people there are. And even though it's an authoritarian state, it's very difficult to manage all of that. So many people in such a large area. So the Communist Party really has its hands full just dealing with Chinese issues. They're not really interested in adding to their problems by having big adventures overseas and doing stuff like that. There's always a chance they'll do it because some institutional player just kind of wants to. You know, the military maybe really wants to push into the islands and in the South China Sea and do something there. But beyond that, I don't really see them really getting really ambitious in that regard. And the Communist Party has been going out of its way to try to maintain and, you know, really push control of the military. It was already pretty secure, but they've been pushing that more under Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping's whole bag has been reestablishing the supreme authority of the Communist Party of China.
Some of you might be wondering, well, which islands are they trying to take? They want to take the islands of symbolism.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not, like, really worthwhile islands. They're mostly just rocks and atolls.
But they're our rocks. That's the thing.
Yeah. Yeah, these belong to us. These stones belong to us. They are symbolic of the blood that has been shed by our people.
By divine right. This is my rock.
Let's see. So, to answer the question, what potential does China have to shake up the world economy? A lot. But in the future, it's going to depend on how much future economic growth they can generate. Is it in their interest to do so? It kind of depends on how they themselves will define their interest in future, but given how risk-averse they are, probably not. Certainly they could. They could leverage their economic heft to try to push countries to take more money from them for infrastructure projects, and to try to pressure countries into not criticizing them diplomatically over this, that, or the other thing. So there is some interest there to use their economic heft. But I don't know that there's really enough willpower on the part of the party to really do it. Let's put it like that. And that's, you know, if they really did start to throw their weight around, there would probably be a reaction from the United States and Europe. And keep in mind that together, the United States and Europe have combined economies that comprise like most of the world's economic activity. So if the US and Europe really started working together and leveraged enough support from regional allies in Asia, not other parts of the world, they could really bring the hurt to the Chinese economy. If they wanted to. That's not to say that the Chinese couldn't weather it, but that would bring a lot of pressure to bear on them they haven't really faced before. So even if they wanted to throw their weight around rather, there would be a little concern. They would hesitate because it would be more likely that they would generate that kind of backlash, and they don't want to be isolated like that. What do you think of recent trend of merging the political economy with political science in universities? How do you feel about the recent push towards quantitative aspects in economics proper to distance itself from political economics? Yeah, I hadn't really heard about this trend. I had heard about the shift towards quantifiable research, quantitative research rather. That's been kind of a long-running trend. I hadn't heard
numbers.
Well, numbers don't lie as much as people do. And qualitative research is a lot more people-dependent than numbers are.
Yeah, if you can mess with graphs and charts and stuff in ways that can mislead people, though.
Oh, for sure. What was the old, what's his Mark Twain quote? Do you remember it?
He has a lot of quotes.
Lies. It was lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, kind of commenting on how statistics can be manipulated. Yeah, for sure. But at least there's something concrete to manipulate. With qualitative research, it's kind of putty, it's sort of amorphous and unexact, and people kind of talk past each other and define things differently without realizing it. It's just a little more tricky to navigate. Hence the shift towards quantitative research in the 1970s, in the 80s at least. I think that's kind of when it started. But I hadn't heard about merging political economy with political science. It kind of makes sense. There's a lot of overlap. How do you feel about the recent push towards the quantitative aspects in economics? Yeah, I pretty much just comment. I would say it's a net good thing. Because just in general, it makes the science more rigorous. It kind of raises the bar for the quality of research. And it makes it just more difficult for people to kind of just go on rants. Kind of just turn the science into basically cable television. Yeah, you can kind of still do that, but you got to have some rigorous math underneath it somewhere. Got to have something concrete you can point to that people can kind of debate. So I think overall, quantitative research and the shift towards it has been a net positive for the sciences. It makes it more rigorous, and that's good. But it has kind of hurt in terms of, there is room for qualitative research that is still useful. Because you still got to interpret the numbers and whatnot. But it has kind of hurt that, in a sense. Hurt the quality of qualitative research and reduced the scope for it. And I think that's reduced the scope of research as a whole. Because there's only so many things you can quantify and research and do research on in a quantitative way. That kind of narrows the scope substantially, I think. So I think there should still be some scope left for qualitative research. I think there should still be a role for that. Which is not to say that we should go back to what it was before, but I think there's kind of a narrowing of focus excessively to a degree. Mind you, I'm not an academic. I did not get my PhD. That was a failed endeavor.
You have 2 masters, dude.
When you're in a PhD program and you're around super smart people, most of whom succeed in getting their PhD, master's degrees don't feel as impressive.
All I have is a bachelor's, and a lot of people who are listening don't have any degrees. So, I mean, yeah.
I'm just giving you my perspective. It feels like a consolation prize.
Grab 100 people off the street, you're more of an academic than them. So, it resonates with me as the type of question in StarCraft is, when can you say that you're a good player?
Huh. Yeah.
Because a lot of people, if they don't play StarCraft, they watch me and they're like, oh my god, he's just so fast, I can't even keep up. And then you have the tournament players who make a living with their results in tournaments, and relative to them, I'm a garbage can. I'm actually terrible. And it's like, what is this guy doing? He just streams so much, you can tell why he's bad. But it's me in both cases. It depends on the point of reference. So, yeah, sure. Against the people who completed their PhD, it's like, oh, yeah, I'm not an academic. But compared to me, it's like, yeah, dude.
Well, all things are relative. That's a fair point. That is a fair point. But the point is that I'm not up to date on like academic trends and whatnot, because I haven't really been in that world for a while, so I'm not real sure where the science is or kind of where the quantitative revolution is going and whatnot. I would kind of have to read somebody's blog, basically, see what's up with that, or read the research, or read the actual literature. Let's see, so did we... I think we pretty much covered that. Yeah, so we'll... There's 2 more from last week. Did we have any new ones? We did have a few new ones. Recently, Congress dropped its support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. What consequences of this for Saudi Arabia and Yemen? None. No consequences. Congress dropping its support for the war in Yemen is largely a symbolic vote, because it's probably not going to get past the Senate, I think, is the block. Yeah, so it's principally a symbolic vote, from what I read. This is me remembering what I read. So it's probably not going to change anything, really. Mostly it's just a signal to Saudi Arabia that they're kind of skating on thin ice, so to speak. That's an American saying. That's kind of what you say when somebody's not officially in trouble, but people are suspicious. And that if they do even like a minor thing wrong, people are going to shit all over them.
I say that all the time when someone's trolling the chat consistently.
Yeah.
They're like skirting the line of not quite being banned, but it's like one more thing that's even marginally annoying, and you're done.
Yeah.
So they know.
Yeah, I think Congress is just signaling to Saudi Arabia that they don't have the power yet to really challenge the American relationship with them and to really cut supplies and support and whatnot, but they are signaling that there is a constituency to do that and that it's growing in power the more stupid shit they do. So, more signaling, more political signaling than substantive change in that regard. Yeah, if you're living in Yemen and you're hoping the war's going to end all of a sudden, don't hold your breath. Although I think there is a ceasefire upcoming. Well, there was supposed to be one before, but they had to delay it because it was broken, basically. We'll see if the new one holds. There is some hope there. What are the unseen social ramifications of a social credit system like in China? Unseen social ramifications. That's tricky. That's tricky.
The Dota community will be in an uproar.
You even play Dota in China?
Yeah, they're actually incredibly strong in Dota too.
Oh, they still allow that, huh?
Yeah, well, they have some changes. So some of the heroes they had to change to make them more in line with what the Chinese government wanted.
Oh yeah, the whole skeletons thing.
Yep, Skeleton King is now what's his name? He looks more like... Oh, he's Wraith King. That's what he is.
Gotcha.
So he looks undead, but not quite a skeleton.
Yeah, it's like really... Sorry, go ahead.
There's a tournament coming up in Dota. There are probably people who are more aware of the details of this than I am, but apparently all of the talent who is going to be casting, commentating, and playing in this tournament based in China would have to go through a series of kind of education programs before they were allowed to broadcast live of like what you can and cannot say and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of people were saying that if that's the case, then they're not going to go. I don't know if there have been any updates on this particular event, but I do know that that was something that has been causing a rift in the community.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it might have been the TI next year, which is the biggest Dota tournament of the year, and I think might be the biggest tournament in the world by prize purse.
Huh. How do you like that?
Yeah, it's quite the meme.
Well, to explain the skeleton thing, in China, it's considered very, I want to say, taboo to portray skeletons because the remains of your ancestors are sacred, and Chinese culture has this has been heavily influenced by ancestor worship and ancestor worship culture, and so part of that is that you don't really just illustrate bones. I think that's true. If somebody knows more about that, please elaborate on that. But I think that's my impression of it anyway. So it's kind of taboo to show bones in media and whatnot. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure what I mean, it's hard to answer because it's hidden ramifications, and that I don't think anything on that scale of China's social score system has been done before. So it's hard to say just what kind of... You could say it would make people behave better, since there would be significant repercussions to getting a bad social score, so to speak. It could be, though, that it's not really used socially so much as politically. It could be that they kind of justify the system by saying, hey, we're going to track your behavior and we're going to kind of drop the hammer on you if you misbehave, but it may be that nobody really gives a shit unless you do something political, and maybe it's only then that they really drop your score. It may be that it could be easy to, what's the word I want? Subvert the system. Basically, you could just bribe somebody to improve your score. So it may be that the system is really malleable and subject to corruption. It could be that it has the opposite effect intended. Like sometimes, if you pass a really strict rape law, like if you made it punishable, if you made rape punishable by execution, does that deter rapes, or does that make it more likely for rapists to murder their victim? Because they have more at stake, basically. That's kind of there's probably research on that already, but that's kind of the idea. Maybe that by making punishment greater for more minor social offenses, it may be that you make it so that people are more cruel, almost. Because if they do something bad, maybe they have to cover it up and then they'll do something nasty. Maybe not necessarily murder, but maybe they'll bribe somebody or what have you. It just could make the whole of society more cutthroat, because people have that bludgeon they can use. They can threaten people with a worse social score.
What is that like?
Could increase tensions. Sorry?
Criminal ethics? That seems like a philosophical question if you get back to it far enough. Of what is the punishment that should fit the crime, and how do you... It's basically balancing incentives and disincentives, where a punishment is disincentive and an incentive would be rewarding you for good behavior. So I would guess that a multi-method approach is going to be best, where you're awarding people for being upstanding and positive citizens in society, and you're also punishing negative actions, but also, like you said, not to the point where people just go all the way. Because it's like, if you get capital punishment for every crime, then why not do the worst crime as opposed to a minor crime?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. Excuse me.
Felonies versus misdemeanors.
Yeah. So then the other possibility here is that nothing changes. It may be that it's basically just an elaboration on a system that's already in place, because you can already be punished and have your prospects in life significantly undermined by going against the Communist Party of China in public. So that's already kind of true. And it's already kind of true that Chinese society is pretty cutthroat. It is kind of very... Chinese society depends a lot on guangxi, on social networking. Like, it's really kind of who you know that kind of determines how well you live and how far you go. It's changed a bit over time, but guangxi is definitely like the big thing still.
Well, that's basically ramping up the power of shame.
Yeah.
So if your networking potential is super important, then that improves the effect of shame as a type of punishment, which we don't normally think about, like legally instating shame, but that ends up happening. If you go through like court proceedings and stuff, you get in trouble, you get hauled to court, you get hauled to jail, people are asking about where you've been, stuff like that. It affects your long-term reputation, so that's not always listed as a part of the punishment, but like you're saying, in China, that may be the largest part of the punishment. Like even more impactful than the jail time. or whatever.
Transportation matters significantly, so it could have a big effect in that sense. That's a good observation. But then you could go the other way and say that the system lacks legitimacy. Basically, it becomes discredited, or is just discredited right out of the gate, such that people don't trust it. So in that sense, Guangxi could trump the system. And maybe that people continue to rely principally on their own interpersonal relations and just kind of ignore the credit system. They just assume it's biased, or maybe if they don't, maybe even if they don't assume it's biased, maybe they just value interpersonal connections so much and personal references from friends and acquaintances that even the social credit system is not strong enough to kind of dissuade that. That's just the power of Guangxi in a society where there's not a lot of trust. Or maybe you just don't trust that social credit system or anything else above your friends and family. Like their reference matters the most. And then the other possibility is that the whole system is just that nobody trusts it anyway. Like, if the system is discredited like that, people could just completely ignore it, and it could just be like a state thing that affects your prospects for a government job. Something like that. So that's a full spectrum of possibilities for you to consider. I don't know which of those is the most likely or accurate, but something for you to chew on anyway. Hopefully that's a satisfactory answer. Let's see. I think yeah, that's it for the new questions. Okay, where did we leave off here? We had two more from last week. Do you think what Russia is doing now to Ukraine is similar to what Hitler did to the Czechs before World War II? Kind of. It's superficially similar. Because there is that ethnic similarity, and that there's an ethnic group, that there's basically irredentism. There's an ethnic group in one country that wants to join another country that is dominated by their ethnic. In that sense, it's similar. But the context is different. Like in the 1930s, there was the context of the Great Depression, the rise of fascist ideologies. There was a whole different set of circumstances. Whereas now it's almost kind of a boutique type thing. A boutique war. Done to distract people and done for political reasons. It lacks that ideological underpinning that was present in the 1930s. I don't think, Putin's whole thing, and really Russia's political culture since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been in part largely defined by a lack of ideology and a lack of identity. There's not really a common unifying theme to Russian politics like there used to be. Like with communism, it was communism. It was the workers' struggle. It was trying to push and reach that communist utopia, that communist ideal. That was sort of the unifying ideology. Before communism, it was the absolute power of the Tsar. The Tsar was the great father, the representative of the nation, the great leader, and everybody just kind of revolved around him. So from absolute monarchy to communism to nothing. Like there's not really any one thing, one ideology that can really be said to be the Russian political ideology. There was an attempt to make it liberal democratic in the 90s, but that kind of floundered because Russia in the 90s really struggled economically, and everybody kind of blamed the political system for that. But ever since then, there's kind of been a continual search for something new. And Vladimir Putin has kind of tried different things with that. He's kind of tried to... One of the principal things he's done is try to resurrect the Russian Orthodox Church and try to resurrect sort of conservative Russian identities. Sort of the Cossacks and religious life and that kind of thing. Basically trying to resurrect that czarist political culture, but that hasn't really been working that well, because Russia now is a lot more urban, a lot more economically developed than it was back then. So it's not really a good fit. It kind of feels like Putin and the Russian government are trying to jam a square peg into a round circle. They're still trying, but it's just not that successful. The more recent thing they've been doing is to try a more militant approach. They've kind of been trying to inspire a kind of militant nationalism, to try to rally around the flag, rally around the government. They introduced, I think, military training in high schools. Somebody from Russia can correct me on that. But I think I remember reading that there was like some militia training or something for kids in school. So there's been some militarization of society to try to build some of that common identity. But I don't know if that's going to work either, because that only works in so much as there's a perceived threat to Russia. And Putin and the government have been kind of crying wolf for a while now. They keep saying the West is out to get them, that they were going to invade them, all that jazz. And it hasn't really happened. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm sure there's a lot of arguments in Russia about Western misbehavior of one sort or another, but fundamentally, I don't think the West really has much to gain by invading or conquering or overthrowing the government of Russia. Like, fundamentally, the principal thing the West wants from Russia is natural resources, and it's going to get them because Russia needs to sell those resources more than the West needs to buy them. So if the West wants them, they know that they're going to get them because of that imbalance in the relationship. Beyond that, I mean, there's no benefit to trying to invade and conquer Russia. It's just too difficult. It's too much space. The people are too angry, militant. Russians are pretty tough. So I don't really see it as being like a really viable option. So just for those reasons. Sorry?
How many symbolic rocks do they have, though?
They got a lot of symbolic rock.
That's awesome.
They got a whole bunch. But I don't think it's anything that anybody really wants to fight over, fundamentally. But for those reasons, I don't think that you can really compare the Sudetenland crisis in the 1930s with the Crimea thing. I think they're similar. They're definitely similar superficially. But I think the underlying context is what really makes them, in that sense, they're not really the same. Can you comment on the overall relationship between Russia and China? A friend had commented that recent Russian aggression might be in part due to growing Chinese power. That's an interesting question. Some people like to say that Russia and China have an alliance, that they're aligned against the West as a bloc. That's basically a myth. They don't have any such alliance, and they're willing to cooperate with each other when they have common goals. And in so much as both Russia and China are critical of the international establishment, sort of the status quo, they do cooperate kind of on that. But beyond that, not much. They'll have the odd military exercise together and whatnot, but they really don't fundamentally trust each other any more than they trust anybody else. That's the thing about being an authoritarian, right? Authoritarianism breeds mistrust, not only within your political system, but between nations. There's more trust between democracies because politics are more transparent. So if somebody's going to try to screw you, you kind of see it coming and you can hedge. But with an authoritarian government, everything's opaque. So if the other authoritarian decides to stab you in the back, you're not going to see it coming. So authoritarians have to hedge their bets when they deal with each other. The only time they don't is when one has a lot of leverage over the other. Like with Central Asia, most of the Central Asian republics are authoritarian to some degree. And Russia has a lot of leverage over them, so it can kind of force them to kind of align more with Russia. There's economic incentives to do it anyway, but because that leverage is there, they kind of have to trust the Russian government. But the Chinese government doesn't have to trust anybody. They don't have to worry about that. So there's kind of cooperation, but also mistrust and concern at the same time. So that kind of defines their relationship, basically. So I don't think Russian aggression is being driven by growing Chinese power. I don't think they're really worried about China such that they feel they have to kind of build a big empire again to counter them. Russia's strategy in response to growing Chinese power is to basically play the West off China. They're basically going to do what a number of countries did during the Cold War. Like if you're a weak country in the Cold War, it behooves you not to side with one side or the other, not with the West or the East. It behooves you to try to get as much as you can from both, try to play them off each other, kind of force them to compete for your attention and support. Russia's going to do that, only on a bigger scale, basically. They're not going to side with the West against China, but they're not going to side with China against the West either. They're going to try to play them off each other and try to get as much leverage as they can. They're not really doing that now because of the whole Ukraine thing. That's kind of a bit of a... I still think that they kind of bit off more than they could chew on that. Again, like I've argued before, There would have been easier ways to get the Crimea if they'd wanted it. There would have been easier ways to destabilize Ukrainian politics such that they couldn't get in NATO. That's what they worried about. Like, there were better, more subtle ways. I think they really kind of bit off more than they could chew by taking the more forceful approach. And I think they partly did that for political reasons, specifically because it was going to be showy. I really think the Putin government was really trying to drum up political support by doing it in a really spectacular fashion. But that's a whole other conversation. The point is, right now they're kind of a little more dependent on China than they want to be. There's actually a really good anecdote to kind of illustrate that, because after Europe and the United States slapped Russia with a bunch of sanctions, there was a lot of concern on the part of Russia where they would kind of get that export revenue. And so they went to China and they started signing a bunch of new gas deals with China in order to try to make up the difference. And they had kind of been hoping that China would give them a discount, kind of out of solidarity, and they did not get a discount. The Chinese were like, yeah, no, we're not paying you full. You're going to sell this gas for a little bit cheaper for us because we know you're not going to be able to sell as much to the West. So that kind of illustrates that it's not like a really friendly relationship. It is kind of an opportunistic one. You know, if one side or the other thinks that they can leverage power to get more out of the other, they're going to do it. Let's see. So I think we are tapped out for question. Oh, we had one more. What's the meaning of the 1848 and John TX 1848? That's a reference to the 1848 liberal revolutions in Europe. For you Americans listening, that's liberal as in classical liberalism, as in rule of law, pluralistic politics, democratic political system, independent judiciary, laissez-faire economics, all that good stuff.
Is that like
That's
Bernie
all.
Sanders?
No, not that kind of liberal. That's classical liberalism. In
Oh.
1848, there was a whole series of revolts and protests and instability around Europe inculcated by liberals trying to bring down the monarchist status quo, basically. It was not successful, at least not very. But it did set the stage for reforms that would take place over the subsequent couple decades that would see the emergence of liberal institutions in most European nations. So 1848 was kind of that. It was the big liberal moment in European history. Well, other than the French Revolution. That was also the year that a lot of migrants came over to the United States. I don't know how many Europeans listening know this, but in the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, there was a whole shit ton of basically political immigrants, people who left Europe for political reasons. And a lot of them came to the United States. And so a good chunk of America's population today is descended from those people. But basically that's it. It's just kind of a cutesy historical reference. That's it. We have done all of question. And we're still good on time, or how's that?
Yeah, we
doing?
could go for another 20, 30.
Cool.
If your voice is fine.
It's getting a little dry, but it's still doing good.
Alright, we can do 20 then.
What do you think the new Brazilian president will do for Brazilian politics in the region at large? That's a tough question. You know, the whole thing about Bolsonaro is that he's unpredictable. Right? We don't really know entirely what he's going to do. It's kind of like Trump in that vein. You know, he kind of has a really bombastic political campaign while running for president, but you don't really know how much he's actually going to do when he gets into office. I mean, I don't know that there's much he can do for Brazilian politics, because Brazilian politics suffers a lot from, you know, a culture of corruption, you know, the economic malaise of the Brazilian economy. There's some structural problems there that he's not going to be able to solve by himself. So I don't think he's going to change much of that. He may even exacerbate it if he ends up being a really corrupt politician. You know, that could be true too. I don't know. It remains to be seen. I think at the very least he'll try to open up the economy. That could be good. You know, that'll kind of provide more opportunities for people, generate some economic growth, kind of get that economic engine running again. But I don't know if he'll have the votes in Brazil's legislature to kind of get it done. Because I know his party picked up seats in the legislature, but I don't think it's like a dominant share. I think it's still pretty evenly balanced. You know, any Brazilians listening, please correct me on that. But yeah, I don't know. Beyond the economy, I mean, I don't think it's going to do much about crime. That's one of those kind of sticky issues. It's hard to resolve. So there was crime, there's the economy. What else would there be? I don't think he's going to do... I don't think he campaigned on political to change any of that. So yeah, I don't know that there's a lot he can do domestically beyond economic reform. That would be the main thing, but I don't know that he has enough political support for that. So it may just be that there's a lot of deadlock and that he has to resort to a lot of bombastic, you know, a lot of loud noises, basically. Loud political noises, just kind of making a big show of being in office and all the... doing a lot of superficial things to try to show his base that he's doing something for them. But beyond that, I don't know how much he can really substantively change.
Posturing, yay!
Yeah, posturing is big in politics. It's cheap and easy. You don't have to do anything, really, but everybody thinks you are. What he'll do internationally, I don't know. He said that he would deal with the Venezuelan government, like in a really threatening way.
I'm gonna deal with him.
But I don't think he's actually going to do that. You know, it would cost a lot. There would be refugees. It would be a big mess. So I think that was cheap talk on his part. I don't think there's any substance to that.
What do you mean deal with them? I'm gonna tweet at them angrily.
Yeah, I think that's probably what some of that policy will end up being. But other than that, I don't think he really ran on anything else international. He did say that he would align more with the United States, so that you could see more kind of a détente there. You could see maybe an economic relationship, you know, lower tariffs, maybe a trade deal of some kind. You could see Brazil throwing more diplomatic support behind American initiatives on various global issues like China or the Middle East or what have you. The thing is, I would expect him to want a quid pro quo on that. I don't think the Bolsonaro administration is going to do anything for the Trump administration without some expectation of something in return. Like, for example, Bolsonaro might ask for the United States government to reduce or get rid of the steel tariffs that were raised last year as a kind of quid pro quo in exchange for Brazilian support. And I don't know if the Trump administration is going to be willing to do that, because that steel tariff was kind of a feather in their cap for their steel producer supporters in the Midwest. So it may be that at first that there's kind of friendlier relations and some cooperation in certain areas, but eventually relations will probably sour once it becomes apparent that there's not a lot they can really do for each other, fundamentally. So it might be that that kind of plays out over the next couple of years. We'll see, though. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is something substantive they can cooperate on. I don't know what it would be. Maybe something bullshit that they could kind of conjure up and just kind of pretend is substantive. That's always a fun option for politicians. Yeah, I mean, other than the US and Venezuela, I don't know if there's much else that he would really change. Nominally, the South American Union has been developing as an institution, but that's kind of stalled out a bit. I don't think he would do anything different there. I don't think he would advance or regress that process of institution building. That's pretty much my reading on it. I'm not a Brazil guy, so I don't know a lot about the politics there, but that's, from what I've read, that's kind of my understanding. That's my prediction, let's say. Actually, that's something we could do, isn't it? We could look at the country chart. Let's see who we have. Some Americans, Canadians, usual the Anglo-Saxons are always well represented.
That's because I speak English.
Well done. And it's kind of the international lingua franca. Let's see, we got some Scandinavians, your people. Some Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, Finns. Just a quick question to the people from Finland who are listening. Do you consider yourselves Scandinavian?
Ooh, geography questions.
Well, it's not actually a geography question, because Scandinavian is almost more of an identity.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a Finnish person who said that they like to think of themselves as Scandinavian, but they're not really. So I'm curious what people listening might think about that.
Well, in the art of Viking warfare, Finland is not really a player in that story. It seems like Finland has become more Scandinavian over time. In terms of the way that it looks on a map and how it interacts with the other countries in the region and its impact on the extreme metal genres. But yeah, I don't know.
That's a good reading. They were a part of the Swedish Empire for a long time, I think, so there is some Swedish influence there, culturally and institutionally, but I think culturally they are still mostly Finnish. But I just don't know if they would consider themselves quote-unquote Scandinavian. It's kind of an amorphous term. Let's see. Oh, we had, wow, half a dozen Taiwan. It's an unusually high number for them, isn't it?
Yeah. We did get a host from a Norwegian streamer, I believe, a few minutes ago.
Gotcha.
So that may explain some of it.
So for those people from Taiwan listening, my question would be, what happened with the recent election? Because the president of the DPP party, I think it's the DPP, the president and her party kind of got clobbered in local elections recently in Taiwan, and it kind of caught me by surprise. I hadn't really thought they were that unpopular. So if anybody would be willing to kind of share their perspective on that, I would be grateful. One of the things I like about reading chat after we're done with it, I get to learn something too, and that's give and take in chat. Had some Russians and Ukrainians. We kind of already went over that earlier. Yeah, let me know how I'm doing on the whole Ukraine issue. If you're Russian or Ukrainian, give me a peek of how I'm doing on that. I strive to be better on it. Is that all we have? Had some Bulgarians, had some Israelis too. Shout out to the Israelis. I don't think there's been a lot going on in Israel. Well, I mean, other than the usual.
Infected Mushroom had a new album come out.
Infected Mushroom?
Yeah, it's a really big psytrance music duo. They've basically been the biggest name in the genre for the past 10 or so years. They live in the US now, I think, the majority of the time, but they're Israeli.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can't think, other than the Palestinian issue, I can't think of what's going on in Israeli politics right now. So I guess that could be my question. If you're Israeli and listening, what's the big political issue right now, besides the Palestinians? Because that's always a thing. I think we did have another question here. Can the U.S. do anything that would help Mexico/Latin America deal with its issues while still remaining consistent with the current foreign policy agenda? I assume by current foreign policy agenda you mean non-intervention. Guessing that's the euphemism there. Not really. I mean, in Central America, the problem is mostly social. There was the Civil Wars did a lot of damage socially and to political institutions, and political institutions in Latin America were already not in great shape even before the Civil Wars in the 70s and 80s. So that's just kind of something, that's kind of a super cycle that they kind of have to go through, and sort of slowly repairing the damage from that and rebuilding social norms, social connections, etc. That'll take some time. There's not a whole lot the U.S. can do about that beyond giving like aid and maybe supporting some government programs and that sort of thing. Let's see. Current foreign policy agenda. South America's issues are, well, Venezuela is kind of beyond the scope of help. You know, they kind of have to help themselves on that one. You know, that's kind of a self-inflicted problem there, in large part. And then the rest of South America doesn't really have problems much about. And those problems are mostly domestic problems, one sort or another. I guess you could say drugs. The U.S. could probably do more to help with the drug war, but the U.S. already has a lot of programs and whatnot that are designed to prop up drug enforcement agencies in Latin America, especially Mexico. I mean, Mexico sent its army into the streets to try to fight the drug war, and it didn't really help. So I don't know that there's a whole lot more institutions can do there. I'm sure there's some changes that could be made that would help, but that's the stuff that you would do with internal reform rather than with external help from the U.S. So yeah, I mean, economically, not so much. Politically, not a lot of help the U.S. can give. So there's little things that could help, and there's certainly little things that would help diplomatically, but a lot of the problems that South America, Latin America has are structural in nature. Mexico might be the exception, because Mexico's problems kind of overlap with U.S. problems to a degree, especially with regard to drugs. And the economy, for that matter. But even there, I don't know that... We already kind of renegotiated NAFTA, so that's kind of done. So that's kind of the principal thing that they were worried about. There could be more done on the drug war, but that's going to be something innovative. You know, the changes that would have to be made to really propagate and help with the drug war have to be, like, innovative. And I don't know enough about the literature on the drug war and criminology and all that, criminology and all that to kind of give a good commentary on that. Let's see. What are the chances the U.S. actually extradites Gulen to Turkey? Pretty much zero. Yeah, because there's no legal basis for it. He hasn't done anything illegal here in the U.S. I don't think we have an extradition treaty with Turkey. Maybe we do. I'm not sure off the top of my head.
I know we do with Canada.
Well, we definitely do with Canada. But yeah, with Turkey, there's just no reason to extradite him. He hasn't done anything wrong. Like, I think part of the way the extradition system works, and I'm not a legal guy, so someone please correct me on this, but I think part of how extradition worked is that he has to actually be guilty of something, in his home country. It has to be seen as like a legitimate request for extradition and not just political bullshit. And I think there is kind of a strong suspicion in the U.S. and by the U.S. government that it is more of a political request for extradition. So he's probably safe, and he has residency as well. So he's probably good for the foreseeable future. Let's see. Could you elaborate on U.S. and Mexico/Guatemala relations in my previous question? Yeah, sure. Let's see how much I can remember, though. So with Guatemala, the big problem is they kind of share some of the similar problems with the rest of Central America there. They've got a lot of political... I mean, the government is not in great shape politically. I mean, there's a lot of corruption, and the political culture is pretty weak. There's not a lot of respect for democratic norms and whatnot. And then the economy is largely agricultural and doesn't really proffer a lot of opportunities for people. And then just add in social instability from gangs and whatnot, and it's just kind of... It does not come together to make for, like, a great status quo right now in Guatemala. So a lot of people are leaving for one place or another, you know, Mexico or the United States. And the result is a bit of an immigration issue, as you might have heard at one point or another. So, I mean, the immigration issue is kind of the big one there. As far as Guatemala, Mexico, and the United States all together, that's the principal issue between them. But I don't know that there's a whole lot the U.S. could do to really stem that. I guess we could open up the borders, or... Well, not even open up the borders. We could just create a worker program for Guatemalans. We used to do that with Mexico. I guess we still do, technically. And basically, it's just like a special visa program for workers from, well, Mexico in the existing program, but we could extend it to, like, Guatemala, and we could take in a certain number per year to kind of give migrant workers some legal status beyond what they kind of get now, just coming over. And we could create like a special asylum program just to make it easier for the people who are just trying to escape violence, general violence in Guatemala. But I think a lot of that would be pretty politically controversial in the U.S., so it's not likely. But beyond that, I don't know that there's much that can make it easier. I mean, the U.S. could try to boost the Guatemalan economy, so there's more opportunities, and help maybe send money to the Guatemalan police so that maybe they're more effective. But there's just so much corruption and inefficiency and bureaucracy in Guatemala. I think a lot of that would just be wasted anyway. Fundamentally, when it comes to countries with structural problems to their economies, there's diminishing returns to what you'll get out of financial aid and institutional aid and stuff like that. You can send a bunch of money to the Guatemalan police, but how much of it would get stolen? How much of it would get redirected into political parties of one sort or another? There's limited options there. There's some things you can do that would help. I'm not saying do nothing, but I don't think there's enough you could do to help institutions in Guatemala or the economy to really stem the immigration issue, to stem the tide of immigration into the United States. Mexico could kind of help. They've already kind of de facto agreed to do that. Supposedly, the agreement is that Mexico could act as a safe third-party state in which immigrants could apply, asylum applicants could apply for asylum without entering the United States. Because there's a concern among some that people applying for asylum in the U.S. are just applying for asylum to get into the U.S., and that once they're in, they just disappear. They go under the radar, and then they just don't even bother with the asylum process. So there's some desire to have another location like Mexico in which they can go through the asylum process without having the temptation of actually being in the U.S. already. So that could help. They could come to Mexico, hang out, and maybe there's some NGOs and whatnot who can kind of help settle them and give them some decent living conditions while their application goes through. If the U.S. could expedite applications, make the process easier, lower the bar a little bit, and basically just kind of take it a little easier, that might alleviate the issue somewhat. But the fundamental driver of the immigrants from Guatemala would not be addressed by that.
The example that comes to mind from my perspective is the U.S. intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how you can put a bunch of boots on the ground, you can give people equipment and training, but you can make schools and hospitals and stuff like that, but you can't really change cultural norms just by your presence or by throwing money at the problem. That's something that happens basically at a glacial pace. There are certain critical points where people get upset enough that there's some kind of revolt or revolution and a big change, but the vast majority of the time that is happening over the course of generations, where the opinions of the younger generation are different than the older generation, and decade by decade it moves in the right direction. But from an external country, you can't just be like, well, you guys should institute the same type of democracy and police force and all this stuff that we have. Here's some money to do that. Good luck. They're not going to do that. They're going to keep doing what they've been doing with just a little bit of money on top.
Yeah, I think that's the unfortunate reality. So in that sense, to answer the question, there's not a whole lot the U.S. can really do there, substantively. Mexico's a little different. Most of the drugs that the cartels in Mexico sell, they sell in the United States. And so you could say that the drug war problem in Mexico is not really a Mexican problem. It's really more an American problem that's bleeding over the border into Mexico. It's more a problem of American consumption for drugs than Mexican supply of drugs. Certainly that's the Mexican perspective. They don't really understand why they should have to worry about what they see as American demand. If you don't want drugs, then why do you keep asking for them?
Yeah. Well, another thing is, these drugs that are being trafficked are usually expensive, and the U.S. is the biggest biggest economy in the world, so they have a large demand and a big wallet to be able to purchase that kind of stuff. So it's a big source of potential revenue. And if it's across the border, then they're like, well, once it's across the border, we get the money and it's fine. So that does raise the question of our stance of trying to catch the dealers and stuff like that, as opposed to this slow shift that's coming in where countries like Portugal are shifting it to where drug abuse is a medical problem rather than a criminal problem, and they're trying to address it that way.
Yeah, that attitude could be more conducive to alleviate the problem somewhat, at least. And, the trouble right now is that the cartels have already gotten pretty powerful, so it's kind of hard to wind that back. But there's definitely different things we could do in the U.S. in terms of drug policy that would reduce demand on the consumption and supplies. Well, reduce consumption and supply.
Yeah, it's all black market stuff, but it would kind of be interesting to see how much the shift in cannabis legalization affects them. Because I do know that, like, there will be reports of the DEA catching truckloads full of cannabis. As more and more states legalize it, that's part of their market that no longer exists. So as potentially more substances get regulated in different ways, what is their potential market after that? It seems like there isn't really a logical next drug that comes to mind that states would start to legalize. We're still trying to figure out what is weed and stuff like that.
Here's the thing about that. You're not going to sell as much cocaine as you will marijuana. The profit margin's a lot higher.
Yeah. Well, I've talked with Chad about that before because drugs and stuff, it's kind of TOS with Twitch. Basically, what you're not supposed to do talking on Twitch about drugs is you can't recommend stuff and blah, blah, blah. But with stuff like cocaine, that as a factoid is ridiculously expensive. If you're thinking about the experience you get per time, you have to be basically a rich person or well-to-do to be able to afford that, compared to a lot of other drugs that you'll hear about, like crack cocaine is a lot cheaper. There are a bunch of cheaper options that are worse for the body that are more economical, but like we said, the US has a really big economy, so if people can afford it, then oftentimes they'll buy it, and they get a ton of money, and it's like a money per mass equation for them, because they have to physically move it from one place to another. So yeah, like you're saying, the cannabis market is not as precious in terms of dollar per mass as the cocaine market is.
Sorry, I was looking at the Discord for a second there. Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I would agree with that. There's another issue, though, which is that if marijuana is regulated too tightly in the United States, it could be too expensive, in which case the cartels could just keep selling it. You kind of see that with cigarettes. There didn't really used to be a black market in cigarettes, but ever since the taxes started to go up on them, people started to try to discourage their use. There kind of emerged a black market for cigarettes.
Huh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, there was that. You remember that dude? There was that. He was one of those people who was killed by the police. He was that. I don't remember his name.
My first thought was, wow, that narrows it down.
Well, I'm trying not to say that black guy who was killed by the police, because there's been like a whole bunch of those.
Yeah, for anyone who's outside the U.S., there is a systemic problem. If you are a person of color, you are drastically more likely to be shot by police for crimes that are not violent in nature. So, for example, if a person gets pulled over for speeding in the U.S. and you're white, the question is, am I going to get a ticket or a warning? Whereas if you're a person of color, it becomes a greater question of physical danger of, is this going to escalate into something where guns are drawn and people get shot, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But there was a guy in New York City, I want to say, and he died after the police basically put him in a chokehold and tackled him to the ground, and he suffocated.
Ow.
And apparently had like asthma or something. This wasn't all that long ago. It was just a few years, I think. But the thing that originally got the police called on him is that he was suspected of selling cigarettes outside of the store that he was at. So that's kind of that market. It is definitely there. So the cartels could still very easily continue selling marijuana, even if it were legalized, because like most free market entities, they can do it a lot more efficiently without the tax than the legal producers can with the taxes. So they can kind of take that market share, that low end of the market for cheap marijuana.
Yeah, that kind of raises the question too of the different tactics for discouraging use of certain drugs and substances. I can't remember where it was, but I heard some people talking about places where if you buy a cigarette packet, like all over the cigarette pack itself, it's like you will die if you have this. Super dangerous, and it's like red and skull and crossbones and all this stuff. We don't do that as much in the US, but that's the sort of question, like the incentives and the disincentives of if you don't want your population to use this, how do you communicate that to them? Taxing is one solution, but that does move it to the black market. And then there's also in this case, physical danger and warnings all over it, which it's kind of a funny speculation, but could the containers get so obnoxious that a black market option opens up where people prefer to get a container that's less obnoxious?
Yeah, that's quite possible. Let's see. So
someone just said in Sweden there are photographs of tumors and destroyed lungs on the packet itself.
yeah, they do that in Australia too, actually, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, that's part of the whole discouraging public policy stance they have over there. Yeah, pretty grody. They're definitely effective in being disgusting. I don't imagine that they're very effective in discouraging people from smoking, though. If you're a smoker at this point, given all of the information out there, you're probably hooked. So you're probably not put off by that kind of thing. Let's see. So I think, oh, yeah, just to kind of wrap up the question there. Yeah, the drug issue is like the principal thing between the U.S. and Mexico in terms of what the U.S. could do to help Mexico. There could be a lot of policy changes and coordination there that would probably help in terms of changing how militant the drug war is, pursued, changing the way drug consumption is treated in the United States, cooperating more with the Mexican government to try to clamp down on the cartels, all that kind of stuff. There's also tight economic, there's obviously the economies of Mexico and the U.S. are intertwined to a large degree. But that's not really something the U.S. can kind of do to help Mexico, in terms of helping the Mexican economy. I mean, the free trade deal itself was kind of something to help them. Caused a lot of disruption too, but overall, it's kind of been a net benefit. Let's see. Somebody sent me a question directly in Discord, I think. I didn't even think that was possible.
How is this possible?
Something about social paradigms. If that person is still listening, try to direct the question to who's handling Whiskery Ant?
Whiskery Ant, yeah.
Yeah. Send that to Whiskery Ant and they'll send it to me on the Discord here. I temporarily saw it in the new comment thing, but now it's gone, so I can't see it.
I think people could do that. Probably shouldn't say that because then they might start doing it.
Yeah, I don't know anything about Discord. It's all voodoo to me. I don't really ever use it. I've been using it more lately because of Pulsar, but beyond that, all the beeps and clicks just scare the shit out of me mostly.
I turned off all the notifications, basically for any software you have to as a streamer. I would recommend that. There are enough beeps in life. My phone is totally quiet as well. I talked with a couple friends about this, about like the robocalling and stuff like that. That is really, really obnoxious. You just get multiple calls per day from different states that are basically just noise. So my phone now is set where a couple key people who are like friends and family or partner get emergency bypass, where it dings if they message or call me, but no one else. If you want to really contact me, leave a voicemail or send paper in the mail.
Gotcha. So we had 2 more questions, but I don't know if we have time for them. How do you feel?
Let me see. Okay, one of them is really broad. And then I think we kind of addressed one of them.
Okay.
Oh, I like the last one, actually. That's kind of a funny joke question. Pineapple on pizza is a distraction argument when people want to avoid serious arguments. Are there equivalent things from history you can point to that were notable enough to be recorded as a way of diffusing tension?
To avoid serious. Pineapple on pizza. What is that? A reference to something?
I joke about that a lot. Whenever people are getting really tense in a sort of political debate or religious debate, I will throw in pineapple on pizza as something that people usually have strong opinions about that is effectively a non-issue, that doesn't actually threaten anyone. So he's asking if there's a historical example that's kind of similar, like a joke to get people to laugh in a room when they're being hyper tense about something.
This sounds like a question for someone with social skill. I'm not that person.
Yeah. Well, the example that comes to mind, what is it? The Falkland Islands? Is that a thing?
Yeah, Falkland Islands, Argentina, and the UK.
Yeah. Like, what even is that? Who even has been there? What is that place? That's like, to use some Warcraft universe lore, it's like that big maelstrom in the middle of the map that's just like, it's not a playable area, but then they just chose to fight a battle there. It doesn't really make any sense. But yeah, I guess he was looking for examples like that of historical things that were just so absurd that no one can really defend a legitimate position on any side. It's just pure opinion.
Gotcha.
Oh my goodness.
Well, I think you answered that better than I could.
Yeah, I actually did a joke video. It's going to be on YouTube. I guess I could export it tomorrow or something. One of the characters that I've made up, his name is Jimothy Stubblebubble. I have a mask where he has like a white beard and...
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
So I did a presentation where I drew the graph of political orientation. I can pull it up on the stream here. So it's this. And Jimothy's position is that you have an x-axis and a y-axis. You've got the x, which is progressive to conservative, and the y, which is authoritarian to libertarian. And his opinion is that everyone who is not dead center is wrong, because that's where the lines intersect, and you have the most of all of the elements combined. And it's all done in a very sort of silly way, but my idea was, usually you have a really obvious political slant for a lot of different types of news outlets, and people ask you a lot, like, what's the best place to get unbiased news? And the answer is, well, everyone has a bias. You have to figure out what the bias is and factor that into the way you consume the news. And this is kind of a making fun of all of that, of what if you had a moderate extremist, someone who believes that being the most moderate in your domain is the absolute best position to hold, and that everyone else is being led astray. Because people on the left and the right, they say that all day long, that we're on the left, this is the true news network, and everyone on the right is just wrong, and vice versa.
Yeah, that would be entertaining if nothing else. But I don't know how I don't even know how you would do it, really. Moderate extremists.
I believe the most powerful decision you can make is to do nothing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is...
Have a milkshake. But not just any milkshake. The milkshake that no one else wants.
Yeah. Well, to a degree, you could say that is almost the crux of classical liberalism. It is a kind of meta ideology. It doesn't say that any one thing is the way to go. It's more about creating institutions in which different peoples and groups can kind of negotiate and navigate differences. In that sense, the only thing that's intolerable is intolerance to a degree. The only system, the only ideology you would explicitly reject is the ideology that rejects the system, since that would involve basically rejecting the whole logic of pluralism and trying to navigate differences. So you could kind of call that an form of extremist moderation, or moderate extremism, in so much as it's still a thing anyway. Liberalism isn't popular ideology these days.
That is a tough aspect of politics that fits with StarCraft as well, where a lot of people, they build up their knowledge in a certain way, and they don't respect other approaches that could achieve a similar total result. Like, say I'm a Grandmaster Zerg player, and I tend to play in a defensive and macro way, where I try to get an economy advantage. Some people play Zerg, and they play aggressively, where they try to punch the opponent in as early as possible, and they could have the same Grandmaster rank as me. But some people would say that they're wrong and stupid for the way that they do it. But by the results of the game client, they're achieving the same level of skill as me, but they're approaching the problem with a different solution. So politically, a lot of people refuse to admit that for a given issue, you could have two competing solutions that could achieve a very similar result that might not fit your political preferences, but for the overall population in the area might be net similar. Because we fall into the sports team mindset.
Yeah.
The blue team is the best. No, the red team is the best.
Yeah, biases.
Jimothy would say the purple team is the best.
Okay, well, did we want to kind of...
Yeah, we could call it. This is a good little wrap-up point.
Before we do here, sorry to Steezy D, I didn't get to the social paradigms thing. Did I skip that?
No, that was one of the... We got like 3 questions right here at the end.
Okay. And then, Geezer Frog. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Now, we didn't get to your question here, but I haven't heard... I would be interested if you could send me the economist that you follow. Like if it's a blog or something, like send me a link. Either in chat here, or you could just email it to me. I think my email is somewhere on there. So I would appreciate that, because I would be curious to read their analysis. That's all. Just a quick request there at the end. Yeah, but thank you for having me on again. Thank you for another fun year of doing this. Been very interesting.
Yep, it's some good stuff. Next year, for a goal for this, I feel like there's a bit of networking that could be done to pull in more people who have the desire for this. Because right now, it's kind of the random StarCraft fan who wanders into the stream and is like, this is nice political conversation. It's actually not awful. I'm going to listen for a while. And that's currently our method of gaining people who really like this segment. And I get a lot of people when Sunday comes around, is Adrian Smith going to be on today? So this is good stuff. People like it. We just need to figure out who else wants this kind of content. How do we reach out to them and say, hey, come visit. Check it out. But yeah, good stuff. Been an awesome year.
Good stuff. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Calendar-wise, I will be back on the 28th. So it's possible we could do one on the 30th. I don't know what your plans are. But yep, tentatively, the 30th.
December 30th, you said?
Yep. But this will be on YouTube pretty soon. I just exported Agent Smith 41. 42 will be exported probably this week. And then this was episode 43. Thank you, Whiskery Ant, for handling the questions, and everyone in the chat for providing such awesome questions.
Yeah, thank you all very much, and thank you for listening.
We'll see you on the next one.
Yep, see ya.
GG. GG. Bum bum bum. Sweet.